Hello there and welcome. Tonight, let me gently take your hand and guide you into the hushed, forgotten folds of history, a time when life moved slower, but the struggles were often heavier. When the light of candles flickered against stone walls and the echo of footsteps on cobbled streets told stories of hardship, silence, and survival. This evening, we'll drift into the shadowed lives of those seldom spoken of, the disabled, the infirm, the ones born into broken bodies or burdened with wounds never healed. And we'll quietly ask, what was it truly like to be handicapped in medieval times? So find your favourite corner of comfort, soften your breath, and let your thoughts float with me as we begin this slow and solemn tale. It is not a story of heroes or kings, but of human endurance, whispered in the twilight. The wind that passed over the crumbling village walls of the 13th century bore little kindness. It rattled shutters, whistled through thatched roofs, and slipped under doorways like a silent intruder. In a small hamlet nestled in the English countryside, the kind too tiny to mark on royal maps, lived a boy named Tomlin, his legs crooked from birth, dragging behind him like silent passengers in a world that rarely waited. The villagers, hardened by famine and plague, didn't know what to do with a child who couldn't stand on his own. To them, Tomlin was both a burden and a reminder that life did not promise fairness, nor strength, nor even the dignity of usefulness. In the world outside cloisters and castles, there was no philosophy for disability. There was only labour, and those who could not labour. Tomlin's mother, a washerwoman with hands cracked from lie and winters, carried him strapped to her back as she scrubbed the linens of wealthier strangers. She whispered songs to him, half prayer, half lullaby, as though the rhythm of her words could protect him from the weight of being different. And for a time, it did. But children age faster when the world gives them fewer choices. And Tomlin, by the time he reached 10, had already learned to disappear. He knew which shadows to fold into, which alleyways held fewer stones to crawl over, and which people wouldn't meet his eyes. There was shame, of course, but also an aching confusion. The feeling of being punished for something he could never name, much less change. You see, in the Middle Ages, deformity was not only a physical state, it was seen as a reflection, a divine mark, a sign from God, or worse, the devil. Tomlin's bent limbs inspired muttered prayers from passing strangers, and the village priest, old and wary, made a habit of crossing himself whenever the boy appeared in church. The church taught that suffering had purpose, that illness could be penance, that disability could cleanse the soul, or be a sign of sins not yet confessed. But no monk came to cradle Tomlin's aching legs, no sermon eased his hunger. The scriptures spoke in symbols, but he lived in flesh. It was a world without wheelchairs, without braces, without ramps or rights. There were no doctors for the poor, only bone setters and herbal women who wrapped wounds in poultices and hope. Tomlin had tried crawling to the old herb wife once, the one who lived just beyond the orchard. She offered him nettle tea, and a look of pity so sharp it cut deeper than pain. The pity was sometimes worse than the cruelty. At least cruelty made him real. When village boys threw stones, they shouted his name, called him crook-leg, witch baby, God's forgotten. But pity reduced him to a shadow, a thing to be looked past. Work was the heartbeat of the medieval world. To not work was to not exist, and Tomlin, unable to plough fields or haul carts, could offer little in return for the food his mother begged or bartered for. The days he spent alone in the forest edge, watching squirrels do what he could not, climb, leap, vanish, were the days he felt most human. Alone with the trees, there were no expectations, only the soft hush of wind and leaf. Still, even the forest wasn't always kind. One late summer, while pulling himself through a tangle of roots near the river's bend, Tomlin heard bells. Not the village bells, but softer, more melodic, distant, yet closer than reason. And then he saw them, pilgrims. A group of dusty travellers with scallop shells pinned to their cloaks, winding their way toward the shrine of St. Ethelbert. Pilgrims were holy, revered. They carried burdens, sometimes physical, often spiritual, and walked to cleanse themselves of sin. Among them was a man with one arm and another who leaned heavily on a carved wooden staff. Tomlin's heart stirred. Perhaps there was a place for him too, somewhere along that path. A place where the broken walked not as outcasts but as seekers. He followed them as far as he could, crawling when his arms allowed, resting when the ache in his joints became unbearable. No one turned to help. They had their own pain, their own pace, their own prayers to recite. That night, beneath the stars, he listened to their singing, gentle, repetitive like waves lapping the shore, and he wept, not because he was alone, but because the song was beautiful and he still belonged to it, if only from afar. Back in the village, his mother lit a candle and waited. She feared wolves, she feared the cruel games of boys, but mostly she feared the silence, for in silence, a mother knows. When Tomlin returned, bruised and empty-handed, she didn't scold him. She simply held him, rocking gently on their dirt floor, whispering stories of saints who healed, of angels who walked among men, unseen, stories she barely believed herself anymore. But Tomlin listened, because even if the world saw him as broken, the stories made space for him. And sometimes that was enough. In time, the seasons turned again. The village priest died, and a younger one took his place, a scholar from the city, curious and unafraid. He noticed Tomlin. Not just the legs, but the boy. He brought books, spoken stories of other lands, of lepers cared for in distant infirmaries, of the order of St. Lazarus, where the sick found sanctuary and purpose. Tomlin listened, hungry not for bread, but for meaning. Could there be a world where the broken were not cursed? He didn't know yet, but he had begun to wonder. And in that wondering, the story truly begins. The morning after the priest first spoke to him, Tomlin awoke before dawn, the fog still clinging low over the thatched rooftops like breath over sleeping mouths. His arms ached from the crawl he had made the day before, the stones of the village path having worn his skin raw beneath the linen wraps his mother tied around his elbows. But there was a quiet stirring in his chest, not unlike the moments before rain, when the air thickens with possibility. The young priest, Father Aldwin, had arrived only a month prior, sent from a distant abbey after the old priest's passing. Where the former had thundered sermons like judgment, Aldwin's voice was like the hush of candlelight, even when reading aloud. He was not much older than Tomlin's eldest brother had been, before a winter fever took him in the year of the hard frost. He wore his cassock without fuss, and spoke Latin not with pride, but with patience, and more curiously, he asked questions. The first time he noticed Tomlin, he had offered a loaf of barley bread and a soft, almost embarrassed smile. Tomlin had taken it without words, used to the silence that charity demanded. But Aldwin didn't walk away. Instead, he knelt, not in pity, but in a deliberate gesture of equals, and asked the boy his name. That alone was rare enough to feel like a miracle. And so, the next morning, when the first bell rang from the chapel and the mist hung like memory over the village square, Tomlin made his way slowly, dragging his limbs over cobbles slick with dew. By the time he reached the chapel door, his breath was shallow and his arms trembled. Aldwin greeted him again, this time with a book. "Have you ever seen parchment this fine?" he asked softly, crouching beside Tomlin, holding the book open just enough for the boy to see the gilded edge of a hand-painted illumination, a figure of Saint Dymphna, her face serene and strange. Tomlin shook his head. "She is the patron of those the world misunderstands," Aldwin said. "Some say she watches over the mad, others over the forgotten." Tomlin's eyes stayed fixed on the page, not the saint, but the lines of writing beneath her, marks that meant nothing to him, yet hinted at secrets just out of reach. "I can teach you," Aldwin added after a pause, as if uncertain whether the offer was too bold. "If you'd like." It was the first time anyone had ever offered him something other than alms or prayer. Tomlin didn't answer with words. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn motion, as though afraid that speaking might shatter the moment. And so began a new rhythm to his days. Each morning, Tomlin would inch his way to the chapel, his arms wrapped tighter with every passing week. Aldwin brought scraps of parchment, bits of charcoal, and sometimes even wax tablets smoothed from the abbey's leftovers. He began with letters, simple shapes drawn with gentle pressure over and over, until Tomlin's knuckles cramped from the effort. A is for angel, B for bread, C for Christ. The words were a bridge, shaky but steadying. And across that bridge, Tomlin began to glimpse a world he had never imagined himself part of. But the village noticed. At first, it was only murmurs. The miller's wife, arms full of grain sacks, muttering about the priest wasting time on cripples. the tanner's boy snorting as Tomlin passed, calling him father's pet ghost. Some claimed he was bewitched, that his crooked legs were not a curse but a disguise, and that learning letters would only teach him darker magic. The medieval mind was a map inked in superstition, and where ignorance lingered, fear flourished. One evening, as Tomlin left the chapel with a bit of bread in his satchel and smudges of ink on his fingertips, he was met by 3 boys near the well. He recognised them, sons of men who drank too early and mothers who prayed too late. They said nothing at first, just stood there, blocking the path. Then one stepped forward. "What good are letters if you can't stand?" he asked. "Think you're better now?" Tomlin said nothing. He had learned that silence could be armour. But this time, it didn't protect him. The first shove came like a gust of wind, sudden and cruel. Tomlin fell hard, elbows scraping on stone, the bread flying from his grip. One of the boys laughed, another kicked the satchel, but before the next blow could fall, there was a voice, clear, commanding and cold. "Enough." Aldwyn. He stepped between them, robes flaring slightly as he moved. His face, so often calm, was now carved from something sterner. "You disgrace your families," he said, voice like the tolling of a bell. "Leave? Now!" The boys scattered, as boys do, more afraid of shame than of sin. Tomlin tried to push himself upright, but Aldwyn crouched again, helped him sit, and handed him back the satchel. The bread inside was crushed, but still whole. "They don't understand," Aldwyn said softly, brushing dirt from Tomlin's sleeve. Tomlin looked down at his hands, at the dark smudges left by the ink he had so carefully used. "Neither do I," he whispered. Aldwyn smiled then, but it was a sad smile, the kind that knew too much. "That's where all knowledge begins," he said, "with not understanding, with asking." That night, Tomlin dreamed of the book again. Not the saint this time, but the letters themselves. They danced across his thoughts like flickering candlelight, forming words he could almost read. Words that promised something more. His mother noticed the change in him, though she didn't ask. She simply touched his hair when he returned home and hummed the old lullaby under her breath as she stirred the evening porridge. He was still broken, yes, still a boy dragging half a body through a world that prized whole ones. But now he had a secret, a purpose that no bent leg or village insults could take from him. He had begun to learn, and learning in that quiet, forgotten century was the most dangerous magic of all. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, cloaking the village in early twilight and settling a chill into the bones of the stone chapel. Fires crackled with more urgency now, and the scent of drying herbs mixed with the earthy musk of smoke in the air. Tomlin, wrapped in an old wool cloak his mother had once used as a swaddling cloth, continued his slow, deliberate crawl to the chapel each morning. His elbows now bore calluses thick as leather, and his fingers had grown stronger, steadier, not from labour in the fields like other boys, but from tracing letters across wax and parchment. Inside the chapel, the world was still and kind. Aldwyn kept the front pews dusted and set aside a small wooden stool just for Tomlin, low enough for him to reach, light enough for him to drag across the floor. They rarely spoke of God in the strict sense. Their lessons, though rooted in the scriptural, were quietly radical. Tomlin learned not only to read Latin phrases from Psalms, but also the symbols of tradesmen, the tally marks of merchants, and even snippets of Old French that Aldwyn claimed were used by travelling clerics and scribes. Knowledge, Aldwyn said, was a kind of map. It couldn't fix broken legs, but it could take a man places his body might never reach. But Tomlin had begun to understand that the map was dangerous. One morning, before the second frost, a stranger came to the chapel. He wore the dark robes of a Dominican, his cowl drawn low, and his boots caked with the dust of many miles. His voice was sharp, the words clipped with the accent of the southern cities. He greeted Aldwyn formally, then stayed through Mass, his gaze flitting to Tomlin, nan like a hawk sizing a wounded sparrow. Later, as Tomlin traced lines in a wax tablet, the stranger returned. His name was Brother Hieronymus, and he asked questions that were not truly questions. "You teach this one to read," he said. Aldwyn met his gaze steadily. "Yes, and to write, yes." Hieronymus tilted his head. "Why?" Aldwyn didn't flinch. "Because he wants to learn." The friar said nothing for a moment. Then he looked down at Tomlin. "What will you do with these letters, boy? Scribe a charter with your knees." Preach from the mud. Tomlin's fingers curled around the stylus, but he said nothing. I've seen such charity turn to arrogance, the friar continued, the crippled seeking to elevate themselves above their station. It breeds resentment, confusion, heresy. Aldwin's voice was soft, but carried steel beneath it. And I've seen ignorance breed cruelty. Hieronymus frowned, but said no more. He left the chapel that afternoon, though Tomlin caught wind that he'd stayed the night with the Reeves family, those who always seemed to have more bread than they grew. After that, things changed. The murmurs in the village turned sharper. Some whispered that the priest was corrupting the boy, filling his head with dangerous thoughts. Others began crossing the street to avoid Tomlin altogether, as if literacy were a disease one could catch through breath or glance. And one morning, Tomlin's mother returned from market with bruises on her arm and a mouth tight with worry. They say you think you're better than their sons, she said quietly, kneeling to check his wrappings. That you speak the devil's script. Tomlin looked at his hands. The ink stains had faded, but the memory of letters lingered. I only want to learn, he said. I know, she whispered, but wanting doesn't always make the world kind. That night, Aldwin gave him a different kind of lesson. No parchment, no ink, just a story. There was once a monk, he began, who lived in a monastery by the sea. He was blind from birth, but he memorized the Psalms, every line. One day, a scribe mocked him, said memory was not the same as knowledge, that only those who could read truly understood God's word. Tomlin listened, eyes wide in the flickering candlelight. So the monk stood before the abbey, Aldwin continued, and recited not just the Psalms, but the genealogy of every saint in the book. Then he said, the word of God is not confined to the eye, nor to ink. It is in the breath, the ear, the remembering. You may read the book, but I have become it. Tomlin felt something stir in him, a deep, quiet pride. You don't have to prove anything to them, Aldwin said, leaning closer. But you must never forget what you've learned. Winter arrived with an iron grip. Snow muffled the village like a heavy blanket, turning the thatched roofs into soft white mounds and icing the well stones with silver. Travel ceased, so did the visits to the chapel. Tomlin still came, bundled in sheepskin and dragged on a sled his mother had built from a broken door. Each morning the chapel was cold, the air sharp enough to cut breath in two. But Aldwin kept teaching, and Tomlin kept learning. He wrote his name, then his mother's, then a full line of verse from the Psalms, his letters wobbly but legible. He traced maps with charcoal, learned the symbols of trade and church, and even copied a fragment from Boethius, a name he could not yet pronounce, but felt the weight of like a stone in his hand. Then one night, the bell didn't ring. Tomlin waited, curled in his corner near the hearth. The wind howled and snow slid in drifts under the door, but no footsteps came, no lesson, no voice. The next morning his mother helped him to the chapel. The door was ajar. Inside the altar was quiet, the candles unlit, the stool empty. And on the lectern, a single piece of parchment, ink still wet. Tomlin crawled to it, heart pounding. The writing was Aldwin's. I have been called to the abbey, temporarily. Do not worry, keep practicing. The letters are yours now. Tomlin clutched the note to his chest, not knowing whether to cry or smile. Aldwin was gone, but the map he had given was still open, and Tomlin had begun to walk it, in his own way, at his own pace, with arms instead of legs, with silence instead of sermons. In the snow-laced quiet, he picked up the charcoal once more and began to draw a new letter. Not just on parchment, but within himself. He would wait, and he would remember. The days without Aldwin passed like molasses over cold stone, slow, thick, and sticky with uncertainty. Tomlin returned each morning to the chapel, more out of habit than hope at first. The doors remained closed most days, or opened only to let in the echo of wind. Inside, the quiet had changed. It was no longer comforting, it was hollow, the kind of silence that held its breath. At first, Tomlin tried to continue on his own. He set out the wax tablet, warmed the stub of charcoal by the small brazier his mother lent him, and practised his letters. But without Aldwin's gentle corrections, the shapes grew sloppy. Some mornings he found himself staring at the same line of half-finished script for hours, the marks swimming before his eyes, refusing to settle into meaning. There were other changes too. The villagers, emboldened by the priest's absence, let their whispers become voices. At the well, Women stopped speaking when he passed. The butcher's boy spat near his sled one afternoon, then laughed when Tomlin didn't react. Even the children, the same ones who had once chased chickens and shared bits of honeyed oat, now gave him a wide berth. He had become strange again, not just broken but dangerous, touched by not... That was worse in some ways than his twisted legs. His mother saw it, though she never said so. She simply worked later into the evening, folding linen with brittle fingers, her silence louder than most sermons. She didn't forbid him from going to the chapel, but she didn't ask about his lessons anymore either. Then, one morning, the sled was gone. Tomlin awoke to the sound of snow dripping from the eaves, the slow melt of early spring beginning to slough winter from the rooftops. He reached for the thick wool scarf by the hearth, ready to wrap it around his shoulders. But when he looked outside, the sled was not where it always waited, propped against the door. He turned to his mother, who stood at the table with a bucket of early radishes, her hands moving methodically, peeling off dirt with a dull blade. "Where is it?" he asked, voice catching with something between fear and anger. She didn't look at him. "It broke," she said simply. Tomlin didn't believe her. "You gave it away." She didn't answer. The silence between them sat like a weight in the room. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes tired and rimmed with red. "I'm afraid, Tomlin," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say the friar from the south is coming again, that he asks about you, about the priest. I don't want harm to come to you." He wanted to scream, to tell her that hiding wouldn't change anything, that crawling back into the shadows was no better than dying by degrees. But his mouth stayed closed, and his body, his traitorous, stubborn body, could not run, could not storm out, could not even leave without her lifting him. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. For 3 days, he remained indoors. The walls of the cottage closed in around him like stone gates. He watched the chickens through the single window, listened to the clatter of carts on thawing roads, imagined the chapel, dust settling over the altar, the parchment curling with age. Then, on the 4th day, a knock came. It wasn't the harsh, impatient knock of villagers, nor the solemn rap of a friar's authority. It was hesitant, soft, 3 taps. His mother opened the door, and there stood Aldwin. His robes were damp from travel, a satchel hung over his shoulder, stained with ink and bundled with scrolls. His face was thinner, and there was a tiredness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but when he saw Tomlin, his smile returned like the first crocus through snow. "I'm back," he said. Tomlin didn't speak. He simply reached for the edge of the table, dragged himself forward and let out a breath he hadn't realised he'd been holding. That afternoon the chapel was full of dust motes and warmth. Aldwin lit the candles with reverence, as if reanimating a long-slumbering creature. He set out fresh parchment, now rolled and crisp, its scent like wood smoke and promise. From his satchel he pulled out a small wooden case. Inside were 2 quills and a small glass vial of ink, sealed with wax. "For you," he said, a proper hand. Tomlin touched as if it might vanish. His fingers trembled, not from weakness but awe. They resumed their lessons, but something had changed. Aldwin now spoke with more urgency, more depth. He taught Tomlin the structure of letters, not just the shapes, but their lineage. The difference between Roman uncial and Gothic script, the rules of spacing, the weight of a well-drawn ascender, and more than once, he spoke of the scribes' guilds in the cities to the south, places where even a crippled hand, if trained, could earn bread. Tomlin listened, hungry. But Aldwin was cautious too. He warned Tomlin not to show his writing to others. Not yet. "There are those who still believe the written word belongs only to the whole-bodied," he said. "They confuse form with worth." Tomlin understood. Late that night, after returning home, Tomlin stared at the flickering flame of their hearth. His mother sat across from him, mending an old tunic. She glanced up, their eyes meeting. "He's back," she said. Tomlin nodded. She reached into the small basket beside her and pulled something out. The sled, repaired, polished, reinforced with new nails and strips of leather. "I said it was broken," she murmured, "but I lied." He crawled to it slowly, touched the smooth grain of the wood. It gleamed. "I was afraid," she said. "Still am." He looked at her and for the first time saw her not just as a mother, but as a woman who had carried fear like a second skin for years. Fear for him, fear of the world, fear of a future with no place for boys like him. But in that moment, something softened. Between them, a quiet understanding. She had tried to shield him, but now she would let him walk, even if walking meant crawling through fire. The chapel awaited, and so did the words. The thaw of early spring loosened the village's breath, coaxing children back into the lanes and chickens into the muddy yards. Rain replaced snow, and the air hung heavy with the scent of wet soil and burning peat. The world was stirring again, slowly, cautiously, as if waking from a long and uneasy dream. For Tomlin, the return of Aldwyn and the restoration of the sled marked more than a change in season. It was a second beginning, a quiet return to purpose. Each morning, he set out earlier than before, braving the slick mud and puddles with renewed determination. His arms ached, but the ache was familiar now, like the soreness that followed growth. When he arrived at the chapel, Aldwyn would already be inside, sweeping the floor, lighting the candles, preparing the scrolls. Their lessons resumed with an intensity that felt sacred, as if each day was borrowed from time not promised. But something had changed in Aldwyn. Though he smiled, though he taught with the same patience and care, Tomlin noticed the shadows under his eyes. He was thinner now, and sometimes he paused mid-lesson to clutch at his side or steady himself against the lectern. When Tomlin asked, Aldwyn brushed it off. Just road weariness, he'd say. But his silences grew longer. His gaze often lingered at the chapel windows, as if searching for something beyond the hills. Still, he taught. They delved deeper into scripture. Not just to recite, but to question. Tomlin learned to recognise metaphor, to identify contradictions, to wonder why certain words were used instead of others. Aldwyn spoke of scribes who debated the weight of a single phrase for weeks, of councils that rewrote entire books to align more neatly with doctrine. It's not just about copying, he told Tomlin one morning, laying out a passage from the book of Job. It's about understanding, about shaping thought. And Tomlin, with his ink-stained fingers and aching wrists, began to see that writing wasn't merely a skill. It was power, not the kind wielded by knights with swords or reeves with tally sticks, but the slow, quiet power of permanence, the ability to give voice to the voiceless, to shape memory, to preserve truth, or if twisted, to erase it. One afternoon, Aldwyn showed him a vellum sheet so fine and thin it was nearly translucent. Lambskin, he explained, prepared for the Abbey's records. Expensive, rare. He let Tomlin touch it carefully, reverently. But look closer, Aldwyn whispered. Tomlin held the sheet toward the light and squinted. Beneath the clean black lettering, faint curves, older ink, half scraped away, whispered through. It was used before, Aldwyn said. Parchment is precious, sometimes too precious to discard, so they scrape away the old words to write new ones. Tomlin stared at the ghost letters, barely visible. But the past is still there, he murmured. Aldwyn nodded. Always. That idea haunted Tomlin, that beneath the smooth surface of the present the past still murmured, that even erased words left echoes. He wondered if people were the same, if beneath his quiet smile and patient tongue Aldwyn carried stories that no ink had recorded. If Tomlin himself was a kind of palimpsest, layered with scars and silences, his story not yet fully written. Then came the feast day of St. Cuthbert. It was one of the few days when even the poorest villagers gathered for celebration. The chapel, usually quiet and sparse, was adorned with garlands of spring blossoms and candles in every window. Tomlin sat in the back, hidden by a pillar, watching as the villagers filed in, wearing their best, their cleanest, their most performative piety. The sermon that day was given not by Aldwyn, but by a visiting deacon, a man with a heavy voice and heavier eyes. He spoke of obedience, of order, of the dangers of pride in unnatural places. Each soul has its station, the deacon intoned, and those who attempt to rise above what God has granted them invite ruin. Tomlin understood. It was not a sermon, it was a warning, and it was meant for him. After the Mass, as the villagers mingled outside and shared loaves of sweet bread, Tomlin stayed within the chapel walls, seated quietly beside the altar. He did not touch the feast offerings. He did not look for Aldwyn, but Aldwyn came to him. I didn't know he would speak, the priest said, lowering himself to the stone beside Tomlin. They sent him without word. He was talking about me. Aldwyn didn't deny it. You frightened them, he said softly. I've done nothing. You've become something they don't understand, something they can't name. Tomlin looked down at his hands, ink smudged, calloused, determined. The same hands that once could barely grasp a spoon now traced letters across parchment with confidence. "I don't want to frighten them," he whispered, "but I don't want to disappear again." Aldwyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then you must prepare." Prepare for what? For a world larger than this one. In the weeks that followed, their lessons changed again. Aldwyn no longer focused on form. He taught Tomlin how to make ink. From oak gall, iron salts, and water boiled with patience, he showed him how to mend a torn quire, how to bind a codex with thread and glue. They practiced Latin, yes, but also numbers, Roman and Arabic both, and Tomlin learned to calculate grain weight, tally debt, and write receipts. "It's not enough to write," Aldwyn said one day. "You must be useful." And Tomlin understood, because usefulness was survival. Then one morning, Aldwyn did not come. The chapel was locked. No candle in the window. No echo of steps on the stone. Tomlin waited, once, twice, 3 days. Then he heard it, from the miller's wife, spoken with a smirk. "The young priest's been summoned back to the abbey, indefinitely. They say he taught the wrong boy too much." Tomlin said nothing. That evening he returned home, opened the wooden case Aldwyn had left with him, and pulled out the quill. He laid parchment flat, steadied his hand, and began to write. Not scripture, not practice, but a letter. A letter meant to be read, meant to be understood. And in the dim firelight, with ink pooling like shadow, he gave voice to himself, for the first time not through another's lesson, but through his own will. The boy they thought could never speak had begun to write his way forward. The letter Tomlin wrote that night was simple. No ornate flourishes, no priestly quotes or grand Latin verses, just his own voice, raw and measured, shaped slowly through charcoal outlines and careful ink. It was addressed not to Aldwyn, though his heart ached with every line at the absence of his teacher, but to the abbey that had taken him. He did not beg, he did not protest, he explained. He wrote of the chapel, the wax tablets, the words that now lived in his hands. He wrote of his body, not in apology, but in truth, of the legs that did not walk, and the arms that had learned to carry a life. He wrote of the names villagers called him, the silence they often cast like stones, and how letters had given him something none of them ever had. Dignity. When it was finished, he folded it with trembling care, sealed it in cloth, and gave it to a passing peddler headed east. He offered 2 linen handkerchiefs in return, gifts from his mother that she never asked to see again. The man agreed, grunted, and tucked the letter into a satchel that smelled of dried apples and pine tar. And then Tomlin waited, not for an answer, necessarily, but for something to shift. It was during this time that the village began to change in other, quieter ways. With Aldwyn gone, the chapel fell into a slow decay. Dust settled on the altar. The candles were left untrimmed. The holy water turned green at the rim. The visiting deacon returned only once every fortnight, preaching short, rigid sermons, then retiring to the Reeves table for bread and wine. And the villagers too seemed to turn inward. The spring rains brought mould to the grain stores. A sickness spread among the goats. A child died, the blacksmith's youngest, and though no one said it aloud, Tomlin could feel the eyes on him at the funeral, as if misfortune might be catching. His mother tightened her voice, rarely left the cottage. When she did, she moved quickly, eyes low, arms tucked close to her chest. Tomlin asked no questions. He knew better than to stir her pain when it barely rested. So he stayed indoors most days. And he wrote, not always on parchment, which was growing scarce, but on scrap wood, bits of bark, even on the backs of old sermon leaves. He copied everything he remembered from Aldwyn's teachings, preserving it not just in mind but in form. His hands began to mimic the style of scribes, the balance of spacing, the elegant arc of an ascender, the compact coil of a perfect G. Each word, he told himself, was a nail in the coffin of silence. Then, one damp morning near midsummer, as he watched mist rise over the thatched rooftops, there was a knock at the door. His mother answered it, cautious. Tomlin heard only murmurs at first, then a pause, and then, "It's for you." She stepped aside and there stood a man, not in robes but in a dark travelling coat, stained with dust. A satchel at his hip and a roll of parchment under one arm. His beard was trimmed short, flecked with grey, and his boots were too fine for a commoner. "Tomlin?" he asked. Tomlin nodded, gripping the doorway to steady himself. "I come from the Abbey of St. Leron," the man said. "Father Aldwin sent word before his departure, and then we received your letter." Tomlin's chest tightened. The man stepped inside without waiting for invitation, though his manner held no arrogance, only purpose. He laid the roll of parchment on the table, untying its ribbon with care. "This," he said, "is a folio prepared by one of our junior scribes. Take a look." Tomlin leaned forward, carefully sliding the parchment open. It was beautiful, rich, dense black script, delicate red flourishes, marginal notes in a narrower hand. A psalm, one he recognised, but copied with such clarity and elegance it looked like printed silk. The man studied him. "Do you know what this is worth?" Tomlin shook his head. 2 months' work. 3 if the vellum is prepared poorly. This is what feeds us. This is what pays for heat in winter and bread for the infirmary. Tomlin looked up. The man met his gaze without blinking. "We cannot afford to let talent waste, regardless of circumstance." For a moment, there was only the sound of rain outside, tapping gently against the shutters like the hesitant fingers of a child. The man continued. "I've been asked to evaluate you, not to test your piety or to judge your birth, but to see if your hands match your letter." Tomlin said nothing, but he rose, slowly, awkwardly, and dragged himself to the low table near the hearth. His mother had already cleared it. A small bundle sat atop it, his quill, his inkstone, and a folded piece of lambskin he had saved for weeks. He sat. The man approached, watching carefully. Tomlin dipped the quill, steadied his breath, and began to write. He chose not scripture, but a line from Aldwin's lessons. "Verba manent." Words remain. The quill glided, dipped, rose again. His hand trembled once, then stilled. Each stroke, each loop, each line deliberate. When he finished, he stepped back. The ink shimmered slightly in the firelight. The man stared at the line, then at Tomlin. Without a word, he reached into his satchel and retrieved a second parchment. Blank. He placed it beside the first. "Copy this," he said. "The same spacing, the same rhythm, as precisely as you can." Tomlin nodded. For the next 2 hours, the cottage was silent, except for the soft scratch of quill on vellum, the occasional clink of the inkstone, and the rhythm of breathing. Tomlin's body burned, his back stiffened, his arms screamed for rest, but he didn't stop. When it was done, he leaned back. The man examined the work. His eyes moved slowly, measuring every curve, every flourish, every space between words. Finally, he rolled both sheets and tucked them away. He extended a hand, not in greeting, but in offer. "If you come with me," he said, "you will have parchment. You will have warmth, and you will have purpose." Tomlin looked to his mother. She did not cry. She only nodded. And so, with a bundle of ink-stained rags and a heart full of fire, the boy who could not walk took his first step into the wider world, not with legs, but with letters. The cart that carried Tomlin away from the village creaked like an old song, each wheel turn grinding against wood, softened by years of use. Straw cushioned the base where he lay propped against a bundle of linens, the rhythm of motion lulling his body into a dull ache. The Abbey of St. Leron lay nearly 2 days' journey east, along roads that curved through forests dense with shadow and silence. The man, Brother Everard, he had introduced himself at last, drove with calm assurance, stopping only when the horse needed rest or when the reins grew too heavy to navigate the narrow passes. Tomlin spoke little during the journey, though his mind was aflame with questions. He watched the trees pass like ghosts and counted the time between milestones carved with crude script. Each night, Brother Everard kindled a small fire, and though he offered Tomlin food and comfort, he never once asked about the boy's past, or spoke of Aldwin again. He treated Tomlin not as a ward nor as a burden, but as a travelling companion, an equal in silence. When they reached the outskirts of the abbey, the clouds had thinned, revealing the soft gold light of early evening. Tomlin caught his first glimpse of the place not in grandeur, but in smell. The scent of vellum and ink drifting through the air, mixing with the faint perfume of lavender from a nearby cloister garden. The abbey stood atop a low hill, its stone walls more weathered than he expected, moss growing like ivy around the base. But the towers, twin spires that reached into the sky like quills dipped in heaven, struck him breathless. He was helped from the cart by 2 novices, boys not much older than himself, one of whom bore a slight limp. They said nothing, only nodded respectfully as they supported his weight and guided him through an arched corridor, dimly lit by flickering sconces. Inside, the abbey pulsed with quiet life. Scribes moved with the solemn grace of dancers, each step deliberate, each whisper controlled. The air hummed with the soft scratch of pens against parchment, and in one corner, Tomlin caught sight of a monk carefully illuminating the edge of a page with gold leaf, his tongue resting between his teeth as he worked. It was a world of order, of purpose. Brother Everard led Tomlin to a small chamber off the eastern transept. There a cot waited, a basin for washing, and a small writing desk. On it lay a single sheet of vellum, unmarked, next to a tightly bound quill and a fresh ink pot. "You will begin tomorrow," the brother said simply. "Your trial is not over, but you've shown enough to warrant a chance." Then he left, the door closing with a soft finality. Tomlin sat in silence, staring at the blank page. He didn't sleep much that night. The stone beneath the cot was cold, and the stillness was deeper than the village ever knew. But it was not fear that kept him awake. It was readiness. The next morning he was summoned to the scriptorium. It was a vast vaulted hall with tall windows that filtered the daylight into slanted columns of golden dust. Benches ran along both sides, some occupied by monks in the middle of transcription, others left empty, waiting. At the far end, a tall figure stood over a lectern, organising parchments into neat piles. This was Master Callum, the chief scribe of St. Lyron. His eyes, grey and sharp, studied Tomlin not with pity, but precision. "You've trained under Aldwyn," he said without preamble. "A rare mind." Tomlin nodded. "Then you'll know our standards are not softened for circumstance." Again, Tomlin nodded. He preferred the weight of honesty over the cloying comfort of lowered expectations. Callum gestured to a table already prepared. A stool had been replaced with a wooden bench, low and padded, built for someone who would sit close to the surface. Nearby, a plank jutted from the wall, just wide enough to rest supplies. Tomlin recognised it instantly as a concession. Someone had built it for him. He positioned himself without help, adjusted the height of his body with effort, and placed his hands over the parchment. His fingers, though stiff from travel, found the curve of the quill as if no time had passed. Callum handed him a model page. "Copy this," the master said. "No corrections, no smudges, no waste." And so Tomlin began. It was a legal document, dry, full of clauses and Latin phrasing, but it didn't matter. The work required more than repetition. It required control, balance, endurance. For hours he laboured, pausing only to dip his quill or stretch his aching neck. He lost himself in the movement, in the shape of the letters, in the familiar rhythm that had become a kind of prayer. When he finished, he exhaled through his teeth, the last curve of ink drying just as the bells tolled none. Callum took the sheet, eyes moving line by line. He said nothing. Then at last, "You will copy from Scripture next." Tomlin bowed his head in thanks. The days that followed moved with structured silence. Tomlin's life was now ruled by bells, matins, lauds, prime terce, and between them ink. He was not allowed to wander the abbey freely, but neither was he confined. Meals were modest but regular. Lessons were sparse, for the abbey had no time to teach what had already been learned. Tomlin had proven himself capable. The rest was on him. It was not easy. His body ached in new ways. His elbows bruised from long hours of leaning, his shoulders cramped from holding the quill with absolute stillness. At night he slept with his fingers wrapped in linen, soaked in vinegar and sage to ease the swelling. But each morning he returned. There were no sermons about his place, no whispers of deformity or sin, only the work, the endless sacred work. Weeks passed. One afternoon, as the sun crept low over the scriptorium's stained glass, Brother Everard approached with a sealed parchment. He handed it to Tomlin without a word. Inside, a note, brief, written in Aldwyn's hand. "You were never meant to be hidden. I knew it from the moment you looked at the page and did not flinch. Be patient. The world changes slower than the soul, but it does change." Tomlin read the letter 3 times. Then, without smiling, he folded it neatly and tucked it into the sleeve of his tunic. The abbey bells rang for vespers, and Tomlin returned to his bench, the quill fitting in his hand like a memory too strong to forget. The rhythm of the abbey settled into Tomlin's bones like a second heartbeat. The days were quiet, precise, and cloaked in an order he had never known in the chaos of village life. Bells marked the turning of time, and in between their tolls was the ink, thick and dark, filling pages with a language more enduring than stone. Though he could not walk the cloisters, Tomlin's hands traversed distances his legs never could. Scripture, legal codices, abbey inventories, even fragments of poetry found their way beneath his quill. His work was inspected, sometimes praised, sometimes corrected, but never dismissed for the body that made it. And yet, silence followed him like a second shadow. The other scribes, mostly monks, kept to themselves. They were not cruel, but neither were they warm. A few nodded in passing, others simply averted their eyes. Tomlin understood. In their world, deformity was a thing to be pitied or feared, or worst of all, ignored. He spent his meals mostly alone in the side alcove of the refectory. His food came in smaller portions, delivered early, as though to avoid the awkwardness of shared space. But he did not complain. He ate slowly, methodically, like he did everything else, chewing as he did his letters, patiently, reverently. Then, one morning during terce, Master Callum announced a new commission. A noble family, the House of Debray, had requested a personal copy of the Book of Hours, lavishly decorated to be completed within the season. It would be a major work, paid well, demanding in every way. Callum selected 4 scribes for the task, each assigned a section of the text. To Tomlin's surprise, his name was among them. There was no ceremony in the announcement, just the sharp tap of Callum's finger on the scroll and a brief glance in his direction. "You'll take the first vigils. Begin with Psalm 6. Tomlin nodded once. That evening, alone in his chamber, he unrolled the sample vellum provided for the commission. It was finer than any he had touched before. Smooth, supple, the skin nearly translucent in its thinness. Gold leaf had already been pressed along the margins by the illuminator's apprentice, a lattice of vines and tiny roses gleaming faintly in the candlelight. He traced the lines where his letters would go, heart-pounding. This was not scribbling for practice, not a copy to be hidden away in the abbey vaults. This would be read, held, displayed, perhaps even carried across kingdoms by the noble family's children. His words would live inside the rhythm of their prayers. He dipped the quill, and he began. The first line, Psalm 6, unfurled beneath his hand. Domine, ne in furor tua arguas me. O Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger. The ink flowed smoothly, his hand steady. Each curve of the Latin script was born from hours, weeks, years of silent effort. He shaped every letter with care, not out of fear, but with the solemn pride of someone who had built himself from scratch. He completed the section in 3 days. When he presented it to Callum, the master scribe spent a long time inspecting it. Finally, he looked up. "This is excellent work." Tomlin said nothing, but the praise settled in his chest like warmth after frost. A week later, something unexpected occurred. Brother Reynold, one of the elder monks who rarely spoke more than a grunt, approached him during prime. The monk held a scroll under his arm and a heavy leather-bound volume in the other. He looked down at Tomlin's place on the bench and then sat beside him. Not across, not behind, but beside. He handed Tomlin the scroll. "The registry of St. Sidron," he said simply. "The ink's gone in the margins. Needs recopying." Tomlin accepted the scroll and nodded. Reynold lingered a moment longer. Then, just before rising, he murmured, "You write better than I did at your age." And then he was gone. It was the first compliment Tomlin had received from a monk. Words spread, slowly and without ceremony. Other scribes began asking small favours, checking spelling on marginalia, helping measure spacing lines, copying titles for colophons. A few began leaving pieces of parchment on his bench when they passed, with little notes or jokes scribbled in the corners. He was not embraced, but he was no longer invisible. Still, it was not all progress. One cold afternoon, while delivering a completed folio to the archive chambers, Tomlin encountered Abbot Arnold for the first time since his arrival. The abbot was a tall man, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, his hands soft with the work of administration rather than labour. He stopped Tomlin in the corridor. "You are the boy from the village," he said. "The one with the letter." Tomlin nodded. The abbot studied him for a moment. His gaze was unreadable. "I wonder," he said slowly, "if it is faith that brought you here, or pride." Tomlin's throat tightened. "I only wish to work," he said. The abbot tilted his head. "And if work is denied to you, what then?" Tomlin didn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because he knew too well. After a moment, the abbot waved a hand. "Go on, do not be late." Tomlin moved past him, chest burning. That night, he returned to his desk and added a line to the psalm he'd completed earlier, invisible but the sharpest eye, written in letters barely larger than a flea. Et si opus offerere mant verbum, and if the work is taken, the word remains. As weeks passed, Tomlin's pace never slackened. More commissions came. His name, once spoken with doubt, now carried weight. The illuminators began asking to collaborate with him directly. He was given access to texts kept locked from junior scribes, works of Augustine, Bede, Hildegard, even a battered Greek volume with annotations in faded red. In his chamber, he began copying them in secret, not for pay, not for praise, but for preservation. Because Tomlin knew better than most that what was ignored could be forgotten, that what was cast aside might one day vanish entirely. And he would not allow that. Not anymore. His legs remained still. But his hands were moving, and through them the world was beginning to shift. The end of summer at the Abbey of St. Leron arrived like a long, slow exhale, the kind that rustled through leaves with the hush of old secrets. The warmth of the stone cloisters lingered even after sunset, and the scent of crushed rosemary from the monastery gardens drifted lazily into the scriptorium each afternoon. For Tomlin, the season's end marked nearly half a year since he had first arrived, and in that time the work had deepened, not merely in skill, but in meaning. He had long since moved beyond the initial commissions. Now he was tasked with transcribing more complex works, theological debates, early sermons by desert mystics, and letters exchanged between abbots across distant regions. He copied with increasing speed, but never without care. Each letter remained a small act of defiance, a stroke of purpose against the centuries of silence that had tried to smother people like him. Still, the pace wore on him. The joints in his fingers had begun to stiffen more quickly now, especially after long rains. The dampness of the old stone halls soaked into his bones. At night, he sometimes woke with hands curled tight as claws, pain stretching from wrist to elbow like iron bands. But he said nothing. He wrapped his fingers in boiled cloth soaked in vinegar and thyme. He chewed dried willow bark when the ache grew sharp, and every morning he returned to the bench, because the work waited, and so did the words. Then came the letter. It arrived in early September, carried in a wax-sealed packet alongside grain inventories from the southern holdings. Tomlin recognised the seal before he ever read the parchment. It was from his village, more precisely from the Reeve. The ink was hurried and blotched. The Latin was clumsy, veering into the vulgar tongue halfway through. But the message was clear. His mother was ill, very ill. The tone of the letter was perfunctory. There was no apology, no compassion, only the facts. She had not been seen outside in days, and her neighbours feared the fever was upon her. They could not care for her. She had spoken his name, and that was all. Tomlin read it once, then again. Then he set it down and stared at the wall until the candle beside him burned low. He did not sleep. At dawn he went to Master Callum and requested leave. Just 3 days, he said. Enough to see her, to sit beside her, to thank her, perhaps, before it was too late. Callum's brow furrowed. "The Book of Hours is nearly complete," he said. "Your hand is on every third page. I know. There is no one who can match your consistency midway through. I know." Callum studied him for a long moment, then he turned and opened the register. "You may go, but take parchment." Tomlin blinked. "If she passes," Callum said softly, "you'll want to remember her. The work is how we do that." And so Tomlin packed a small bundle, ink, quills, 6 leaves of vellum. He was offered a space in a grain cart heading west and climbed aboard without help. The journey back to the village was jarring. The roads were drier than before, but rutted and cracked. The countryside seemed somehow smaller now, less mysterious. The trees that once loomed like towers now bent with the weight of coming autumn. He recognised hills, stone fences and crooked markers half sunk in the earth. And at last, the village, unchanged. And yet, not. The people stared as he was helped from the cart, their faces unreadable. Some remembered, others pretended not to. Children watched with wide, uncertain eyes, and the baker's daughter whispered behind her hand. He ignored them all. His old cottage stood crooked and bowed, the roof slightly caved at one corner but still standing. He knocked once, then pushed inside. She was there, lying on the cot, eyes half open, breath thin and ragged. Her hair had gone nearly white. Her hands, those same hands that once scrubbed other women's linen for coins, now trembled with every movement. She looked at him without recognition at first, then slowly a breath caught in her throat. Tom. He moved to her side, knelt awkwardly, and took her hand. "It's me, Ma." Her lips cracked into the faintest smile. "You've got your letters." He nodded. "I did." "And your ink?" "I brought it with me." She reached toward his cheek, but her fingers stopped short. They hovered for a moment, then fell. "I'm sorry for the sled," she whispered, "and the silence." He shook his head. "You gave me everything." He stayed 2 days. He bathed her when she was strong enough to sit, spooned broth into her mouth when she could swallow, held her hand through long hours of fevered dreams. At night, he laid out the vellum, spread the ink and wrote by firelight. Not scripture, not poetry, but her stories, her laughter, the lullabies. The way she twisted her fingers when she was worried. The time she faced the friar down with nothing but a glare and a broom handle. The years she had carried him like a second skin. The winters she had given him the warmest blanket while she froze. He wrote it all. He titled it Mater Nostra, Our Mother. On the morning of the 3rd day, she opened her eyes. Clear, bright, a final gift. "Go back," she said, "where the words live." He kissed her hand. When he left, she was still breathing. He did not look back. At the edge of the village, the reeve met him with a strange expression. "You've done well," the man said stiffly. "You've made something of yourself." Tomlin only nodded. "You know," the reeve added, "some of the boys, they said they used to throw stones at you." "I remember. They remember too." Tomlin paused. "Then tell them this," he said, voice calm. "Every stone they threw, I used to sharpen my quill." And then he climbed back onto the cart, the bundle of Mater Nostra resting against his chest. The abbey was waiting. So were the words. The journey back to the abbey of St. Liron unfolded under a pale, waning moon, its light silvering the tops of trees and outlining the landscape with a quiet sorrow. The cart bumped and lurched along the worn road, its wooden wheels moaning with each rut and stone, but Tomlin did not mind. He sat nestled in a corner, arms wrapped protectively around the bundle that held the 6 vellum leaves of Mater Nostra. He had written her story as fully as he could, as honestly as memory would allow. Each word had been a stitch, each sentence a thread binding him to her through time. Though she had still been breathing when he left, he had known. The breath had changed, quieter, farther away, as if her spirit had already begun walking some distant path he could never follow. And so he returned to the abbey, not just as a scribe, but now also as a mourner. The gates loomed large in the early light of dawn, and Brother Everard himself came to receive him, arms crossed beneath his cloak, the faint lines around his eyes tighter than usual. He offered no condolences, but his nod was deep and knowing. "You've returned swiftly," he said. "She asked me to," Tomlin replied. Everard held open the door to the cloister hall and guided the cart's driver toward the refectory for breakfast and coin. Tomlin remained still for a moment longer, eyes lifting toward the spires of the abbey. He inhaled deeply, the air carried the scent of morning ink and blooming sage, and stepped back into the rhythm he had come to know. But things had shifted in his absence. Inside the scriptorium, he was met not with silence, but with a murmur of voices. Scribes huddled in quiet pairs, heads bowed, hands gesturing in small, furtive motions. Tomlin took his place at the bench without a word, laid out his tools, and unwrapped the vellum sheets from his journey. But before he could begin, Master Callum approached. He did not scold, nor ask questions about the delay. He simply placed a sealed scroll on Tomlin's desk. "From the abbot," Callum said. "He requests your presence this evening." Tomlin felt his stomach tighten, but he nodded. That day passed in a haze of quill strokes and half-heard whispers. The words on the page blurred as his mind wandered, cycling through imagined scenarios: reprimand, dismissal, rebuke. The abbot had never once smiled at him, never once acknowledged his work beyond perfunctory nods. When the bells marked compline, Tomlin washed the ink from his hands, donned his cleanest tunic, and made his way slowly to the abbot's quarters. The chamber was sparse, though larger than any Tomlin had seen. A single arched window cast long beams of moonlight across the stone floor, and near the hearth stood the abbot, clad not in ceremonial robes but a plain habit. He did not look up immediately. "Sit," he said after a pause, motioning to a low stool. Tomlin obeyed, awkwardly adjusting himself until the pain in his hips lessened. The abbot turned. "I've read your letter," he began. Tomlin blinked, unsure. "My letter? The one you wrote before arriving here. And now this," he said, lifting the bundle Tomlin had carried back, Mater Nostra untouched. "It found its way to my hands." Tomlin said nothing. He hadn't meant for it to be read beyond the walls of his chamber. The abbot continued, his voice low. "It is not scripture, it is not doctrine, but it is something else." He opened the top sheet, holding it in the moonlight. "This line," he murmured. "She wore her grief like wool in summer, not because it fit, but because it was all she had left. That is not the language of monks." Tomlin's lips parted slightly, unsure if it was praise or condemnation. The abbot looked at him then, eyes sharp. "You do not simply copy, you create." "I don't mean to," Tomlin said quietly. "The words come when I remember. I only shape them." The abbot folded the sheets carefully and returned them to the table. "This place," he said, gesturing around him, "was built on repetition. Repetition of prayers, of scriptures, of old ideas. That is our strength, but also our weakness." Tomlin remained still, his hands curled in his lap. "Once," the abbot said, almost to himself, "there was a time when monks debated truth, when scribes argued over translations, when a single word might spark years of study, but those times have faded." He turned back to Tomlin. "You are not part of that tradition, not born to it, not trained for it." The pause hung heavy. "And yet," he added, "you may be its future." Tomlin stared, unable to answer. The abbot sat across from him now, eyes steady. "I have written to the chapter house," he said. "There is a gathering of scholars at the University of Paris this winter. If I send you as a novice attendant, you'll be allowed to observe, perhaps even assist in copying texts. No promises, but possibilities." Tomlin's breath caught. "I'm no monk," he whispered. "No," the abbot replied. "You are something else." He stood, and Tomlin followed. "You will leave in a fortnight. Prepare what you must, and bring your mother's manuscript with you. The world needs more than doctrine. It needs memory." Tomlin bowed his head. When he returned to his chamber, he unwrapped the vellum and stared at his mother's words again. This time, not as a son, not as a mourner, but as a bearer of something larger than himself. Her life, their lives, would not be footnotes. He would carry them forward, into halls of scholars, into cities whose names he did not yet know, into the very heart of history. The boy who could not walk would now travel farther than most ever dared dream, and he would do it one letter at a time. The fortnight before Tomlin's departure passed in a haze of preparation and silent anticipation. The abbey, once a place of stillness, now seemed to murmur around him. Monks moved with an edge of curiosity when they passed, glancing toward him as if trying to decipher the future written across his face. Brother Everard handed him a list of supplies without a word, and Master Callum provided a compact writing set, a smooth wooden case fitted with 3 trimmed quills, a small glass bottle of ink sealed in wax, a bone knife and a folded cloth of fine linen. "It's not a gift," Callum had said, his expression stern but his voice quieter than usual. "It's a wager." Tomlin only nodded. He understood. The abbot's announcement had not been made public. Only those within the scriptorium knew, and even they spoke of it in hushed tones. A crippled scribe sent to Paris. It was unprecedented, unorthodox, and quietly, some believed, unwise. But no one dared challenge the abbot, so Tomlin prepared. His chamber, once cluttered with scraps of copied texts and unfinished margins, was now carefully sorted. The bundle of Mater Nostra was wrapped again in soft cloth and stitched shut. He made one final copy of his favourite page, not for anyone else but for himself, a small indulgence, a relic of his grief. The night before he was set to leave, Brother Everard knocked once and entered without waiting. "You'll travel by river first," he said, seating himself on the low bench. "To Lugdunum, then by road north to Paris. There are scholars who speak Latin, some Greek, fewer speak Mercy." Tomlin listened. "Don't try to match their pace," Everard said. "Let them underestimate you. They always will. It's the only advantage you'll be given freely." Tomlin smiled faintly. "Have you been?" "Twice. Once as a novice. Once as a translator, I was less useful than they expected and more stubborn than they preferred. A silence passed between them. Then Everard reached into his robes and withdrew a small, worn leather pouch. "For the road," he said, placing it beside Tomlin. "Dried fruit, some coin, and something older." Inside, Tomlin found a folded parchment, browned with time. It was a prayer, but not one he recognised. The ink had faded to a near ghost of itself, but the strokes were unmistakably from a careful hand. "It's Coptic," Everard said. Copied by a scribe who never learned to speak aloud, he signed only with a dot. They said he was blessed by silence. Tomlin traced the ancient characters with reverence. "When I saw your work," Everard added, "I remembered him." They did not embrace. They did not speak again. In the early hours before the bell for matins, Tomlin was helped onto the cart by 2 novices. A second cart, smaller and more enclosed, followed with supplies. The abbot himself came to see him off, standing with arms folded, the morning fog curling around his ankles. "Do not write for their approval," he said. "Write because forgetting is a form of death." Then he turned and walked back into the mist. The cart pulled away. The abbey faded behind them, stone and silence vanishing into the soft blur of distance. The road to the river was long and uneven. Tomlin wrapped his cloak tighter and stared ahead. The vessel that would carry him downstream was modest, its deck barely wider than the span of his arms. The captain, a short man with wind-burned cheeks, didn't ask questions. Tomlin was placed near the stern, his bundle beside him, and given a thick wool blanket against the chill. As the boat drifted into the current, Tomlin felt the pull of motion not in his legs, but in his chest. It was the first time in his life he had travelled more than a day's crawl from his village. The trees on the riverbanks leaned over like watchers, and the sky stretched above them like a page waiting to be filled. He kept his hands wrapped in cloth to protect them. Wrote sparingly. Observed everything. The world, it turned out, was wide, and much of it had never learned to look down. Few people noticed the boy with the crooked back and the ink-stained fingers. Fewer still cared. But Tomlin didn't need their care. He needed their language. At Lugdunum, he stayed in a modest cell within a smaller abbey. One that bore the marks of war from decades past. Burnt rafters in the bell tower, scorch marks on the chapel stones, and yet the scribes there still worked. One showed Tomlin a page they had rescued from fire, warped, blackened, but still legible. Verbum Dei manate in aeternum. The word of God remains forever. Tomlin slept that night, with his quills wrapped in oilcloth beside his bed, his fingers twitching with the dreams of letters. The road to Paris from there was harder. His arms strained with each mile, the carts less frequent, the inns more crowded and unkind. Once, a stable boy refused to carry his satchel, claiming cripples bring curses. Tomlin said nothing, simply took the burden himself. Another time, a merchant mocked the way he crawled from the cart to the doorway of a hostel, only to fall quiet when Tomlin laid out a page of illuminated text on the counter, in perfect, gleaming script. By the time he reached the outskirts of Paris, his limbs burned with fatigue, his shoulders knotted and raw. But he had arrived. The city opened before him not like a welcome, but like a challenge, sprawling, layered, alive. Bells rang from every direction, smoke curled from hundreds of chimneys. Street vendors shouted in tongues he barely understood, Norman French, Occitan, even Arabic from a cluster of travellers outside a spice shop. Horses clattered over stone, mud thickened under every step, and above it all rose the cathedral, Notre Dame, like a fortress of stories, each carved stone a syllable of some grand and ancient sentence. Tomlin stared up at it, heart-pounding. A porter came to lead him to the quarter where the scholars lodged, the Latin Quarter, they called it. Tomlin would be placed in a dormitory with other copyists and minor translators, not yet a student, not yet a master, just a shadow at the edge of the page. But he carried his ink, he carried his mother's manuscript, he carried his silence like armour, and soon he would begin again. Not by crawling, but by writing, for in the city of words, the boy without legs had come to stand. The dormitory to which Tomlin was assigned stood in a crooked alleyway behind the Rue des Écoles, tucked between a candlemaker's shop and the crumbling remains of a Roman wall. It was a building that had once been something grand, perhaps a minor noble's residence, but now bore the unmistakable signs of monastic repurposing, bare floors, narrow windows and the constant scent of damp parchment. Inside, the air was thick with ink and the sour tang of old wool. The copyists and translators who inhabited it were men of various ages and backgrounds, former monks, aging clerks, young students sent by minor lords to be educated and moulded. And now, Tomlin. His arrival was marked by silence, not hostile but not warm. A few eyes followed him as he was led to the cot at the far end of the room, nearest the wall. Someone muttered something in French, too quick for him to catch. Another man, perhaps 30, leaned out from his bench and gave a slow nod, then returned to his writing. There were no greetings, no welcomes, just the shuffling of paper and the scratch of quills. The University of Paris, Tomlin would come to learn, was not a place for kindness. It was a place for thought, for argument, for assertion and refutation. Here ideas clashed more fiercely than swords. Words were weapons, and memory was currency. Those who wielded both with precision rose quickly. But Tomlin was not there to rise. He was there to endure. He was not yet a student. His name was not recorded in any official book of scholars. His lodging was temporary, his presence permitted only by the permission of a single abbot and the curiosity of a minor bishop with a taste for novelty. He would work, observe, and, perhaps if unnoticed too long, be sent away. But Tomlin had no intention of going unnoticed. The first weeks were spent in the margins of activity. He was not permitted in lectures, but he was given access to the cloistered scriptorium of the cathedral school, a place older than many of the city's stones. There he was assigned to copy glosses, the marginal commentary that scholars wrote in cramped Latin beside the core texts of theology and law. These glosses were often more complex than the texts themselves. They argued, they questioned, they speculated. Tomlin read each line twice before he dared to copy it. He puzzled over the syntax, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to stare into space, the meaning dangling just out of reach. At night he whispered lines under his breath, rolling the words across his tongue until they settled. Then, after a week, something shifted. It happened quietly. A young scholar, Felix by name, leaned over his bench and asked, "Do you know the gloss by Peter Lombard on the Trinity?" Tomlin nodded. "I've copied it 3 times. "Is it true," Felix continued, "that he equates unity with relation?" Tomlin paused, then said, "He questions whether relation can be absolute, not that it is. He leaves room for contradiction." Felix blinked, then smiled. The next day, another scholar, taller, older, with deep-set eyes, asked for Tomlin's opinion on an alternative phrasing of a line from Boethius. The day after, someone handed him a copied passage and asked him to check the spacing. He was still not permitted in lectures. But his name began to travel, slowly, carefully, like a whispered rumour. The crippled boy who remembers everything, the one who writes in silence, the one whose letters are straighter than a bishop's sword. And again, the meeting with Master Ricardus. It was raining, Parisian rain, fine, insistent and cold, like water whispered into one's skin. Tomlin was returning from the scriptorium, his manuscript case tucked beneath his cloak, when he was stopped at the doors of the Collège de Sorbonne by a tall man with a braided belt and ink-splattered sleeves. "I've seen your letters," the man said without greeting. "The margins on the Lombard gloss. The spacing is deliberate." "I try," Tomlin said, his voice measured. "No, you decide." Ricardus studied him. "Come tomorrow. At prime. You'll copy from the sentences. Bring your tools." Tomlin bowed his head. The next morning, he entered the Sorbonne's upper chamber, a narrow hall lined with windows and echoing with debate. Here the masters worked. Here the texts were not just copied, but born again through question. Tomlin was given a place near the wall, a smaller table with a slanted surface, a candle, 2 quills, vellum cut by hand. A page from the sentences lay waiting. He set to work, and soon others gathered. Not to marvel, not to praise, but to learn. They watched his spacing. His method of ruling lines with thread instead of knife, the way he carved letters in rhythm with breath. One even mimicked the gentle slope of his air, and another asked why his descenders curled inward so tightly. "It keeps the words within themselves," Tomlin answered, "so they don't fall off the page." Ricardus nodded. "So the page becomes a vessel." That night, Tomlin returned to his dormitory and opened Mater Nostra. He added a line, written in smaller script at the very bottom, "In civita eloquendi tasseo, sed litera mea clamat." In the city of speech, I am silent, but my letter cries out. He rolled the parchment, sealed it with wax, and placed it under his pillow. Outside, the bells of Saint Julien rang in the dark, and the boy who could not walk now lived at the heart of the world's thought, not as student, not as master, but as hand and mind, steady as ink on vellum. A Parisian winter arrived, not with sudden violence, but with a creeping stillness. The air lost its scent, the sky dulled into slate. Chimneys smoked from every rooftop, staining the air with the sour tang of burning peat and damp ash. The streets narrowed under slush and muck, and even the loudest corners of the Latin Quarter grew quieter as scholars retreated into their books, their cloisters, and the warm breath of disputation. Tomlin, now more recognised than known, continued his quiet work at the edge of the academic world. Each morning he arrived at the Sorbonne's lower scriptorium before the sun had fully risen, his ink warmed inside a pouch beneath his tunic, his hands wrapped in wool cloth. Each day, the pages he produced moved from his table into the hands of masters who did not look at him, but always asked for more. And still he remained silent, not voiceless, only deliberate. His place within the great cathedral of learning was peripheral by design. No one had formally admitted him to lectures, no master had spoken his name before an assembly. But his work passed through the corridors like a signature, familiar in shape even when unseen in body. He listened, he watched, and in that silence he learned more than most who spoke. Through the margin notes he copied, he came to understand the minds of those who shaped the age. The fragile brilliance of Peter Abelard, the logical storms of Anselm, the trembling faith of Bernard. He copied lines of Augustine so often he could recite them backwards. And yet it was not theology alone that drew his breath to stillness. It was doubt, not the dangerous, condemnable kind, but the quiet, scholarly kind. The sort that asked questions, not to destroy, but to deepen. If the soul is incorporeal, how can it be wounded? If divine will is perfect, can prayer change it? If memory preserves truth, what is lost when the words vanish? He wrote these queries in his own margins, always small, always hidden, until one day a line disappeared. It was a Sunday and the dormitory was nearly empty. Tomlin had returned from the scriptorium and unrolled Mater Nostra to transcribe a new page onto cleaner vellum. As he unfolded it, he paused. A note was missing, a single marginal line, one of his earliest, written in faint ink along the edge of a story about his mother's younger days, had been scraped clean. The vellum was smooth but not seamless. The abrasion was careful, practiced, deliberate. Someone had touched his words. He sat back in silence. This was not the abbey where privacy was sacred. Here, pages were read, handled, borrowed, sometimes stolen. In this city of scribes, no ink was safe from the eyes of others. That evening he said nothing, but the next morning he added a new note at the very bottom of the fresh vellum sheet. Tiny, tucked inside the curl of a decorative letter. Qui delere conatur intellexit. He who tries to erase has understood. 2 days later, a small slip of parchment appeared beside his tools. It bore no name, only one word, written in neat and practiced script. Valeo. I am strong. A conversation had begun, but not in voice, not in the common tongue of disputation. Here, in the quiet corners of vellum and wax, another scholar had responded, not to challenge but to acknowledge, and Tomlin smiled. From that day their exchange continued. Brief lines, hidden notes, tucked between the layers of copied glosses and theological treatises. Sometimes they quoted older scribes, sometimes they asked questions, other times they simply left small riddles or Latin aphorisms written in mirror script. They signed nothing, but Tomlin knew. It was someone nearby, someone who handled his pages. Someone who read Mater Nostra not with idle eyes but with care. He began to write differently, not in message, but in intention. His strokes became more expressive, his spacing more deliberate. Every page he submitted for copying held not only the shape of borrowed thought, but the hidden trace of his own. The curl of a cue might echo a question. The narrowing of a margin might answer it. The rhythm of his letters began to carry cadence, not just clarity. And then, in the margin of a copied excerpt from Aristotle's Categories, he found something new. Not Latin, not even Greek, but English, written plainly in an unadorned hand. Did your mother sing? Tomlin sat for a long time, staring at it. Then, on the back of the page where no scribe was supposed to write, he answered, She sang when she worked, but only when I was near. A week later, mine sang only once, the night before she died. Another week passed. My mother did not know letters, but she spoke like scripture. Tomlin responded, then perhaps that was scripture. The conversation deepened. And with it, so did Tomlin's understanding, not just of theology or grammar, but of presence. Someone in this place, this city of minds and voices, saw him not as a curiosity or a crippled hand that copied without complaint, but as something more, as a person. And though he still did not speak aloud in public, his letters gained weight. They moved through the university like currents, copied again by others, passed between masters and students. His name, still unspoken in lecture halls, was whispered in libraries. The one who writes from the edge, the boy with the steady hand. And one evening, as snow drifted gently over the tiled roofs and candles flickered behind every glass pane, Tomlin sat by the small brazier in the corner of the dormitory, quill in hand, and wrote a line not for any scholar, or master, or commission. He wrote it for the one who had read Mater Nostra, the one who scraped and questioned and answered. We are all margins waiting for meaning. Then he folded the page, sealed it with a thumbprint of wax, and slipped it beneath the door of the Sorbonne scriptorium. No signature, only silence and snow. By midwinter, Paris had surrendered itself entirely to the frost. The Seine moved sluggishly under a film of ice, its surface groaning quietly at night like a great beast in restless sleep. Cobblestones vanished beneath slush that turned the streets into narrow channels of freezing mud, and even the boldest vendors drew their shutters early. Fires burned longer in the Latin Quarter, candles guttered faster, and the scent of thawing vellum became a comfort to those who lived among the quills and texts. Tomlin's hands had become adept at resisting the cold. He soaked them each night in heated oil steeped with rosemary and comfrey, wrapped them in cloth and prayed not with words but with motion, a quiet ritual of survival repeated without fail. Pain was a constant companion, not yet cruel but never fully silent. Still, he wrote. Each day he copied with unwavering focus, his pages carrying fragments of ancient arguments and trembling faith. And in the margins, always the margins, the hidden correspondence continued. The anonymous reader, the one who had erased a line and left the word Vallejo, had now become something more than a phantom. They had become a mirror, a confidant, a scholar of the silent spaces. One morning, among a new batch of assigned vellum sheets, Tomlin found a question waiting. Is it the writer who preserves memory, or the one who reads it? He smiled faintly, letting his quill hover over the parchment, then wrote back, neither. It is the one who remembers both. Their messages began to take on a rhythm, a private rhythm outside the structure of disputations and doctrine, sometimes solemn, sometimes playfully irreverent. The stranger quoted Latin poetry. Tomlin responded with scripture twisted into irony. They debated the idea of divine silence, of unspoken truth. Once, they traded 4 lines of verse in the form of a riddle, each letter forming part of a hidden acrostic. The world is too loud to hear grace, one note read, to which Tomlin replied, so we listen in the quietest letters. No one else seemed to notice the conversation, or if they did, they gave no sign. The dormitory remained indifferent to his work. Scholars still passed him in the corridors with the distant eyes of men thinking in 7 directions at once. And Tomlin, ever the quiet observer, gave them nothing to interrupt that illusion. But something inside him was changing. Not in the way of ambition, nor pride. He still knew how fragile his place was. His work was uncredited, his name not written into any official record of the faculty. But now he felt less like an intruder and more like a shadow that had learned how to shape itself. In the Sorbonne scriptorium, Master Ricardus began leaving him more complex assignments. Original treatises, letters of controversial theologians, annotations so densely layered they resembled trees of ink. One afternoon, Tomlin was asked to copy a rare volume of Hildegard of Bingen's Visions, a task usually reserved for those with experience in symbolic illustration. "You've not studied her," Ricardus said. "I've read the fragments," Tomlin replied. Ricardus tapped the parchment, then read between them. That night, Tomlin laboured with a care bordering on reverence. The text was vivid and strange, filled with celestial visions and tangled metaphors. He copied slowly, his strokes smaller than usual, as if he feared disturbing something holy. And when he was done, he left a margin note in the shape of a spiral, an unspoken answer to the imagery he had just preserved. 2 days later, his anonymous reader responded with a simple symbol beneath the spiral, a small flame, drawn with 3 strokes. After that, the notes became bolder. Once, Tomlin copied a fragment of Cicero concerning justice and power. In the margin, his partner had written, "If justice lives only in ink, who protects it from the flame?" Tomlin stared at the question a long time, then answered, the same hands that copy it. A week passed before the next note appeared. This time, not a question, not a riddle, but a name. 1 word, left just inside the spine fold of a bound draft. It was not written boldly, not offered with pride, but with trust. Tomlin read it 3 times, his chest tightening. He did not reply immediately. Instead, he waited 3 days, letting the name settle like a stone in still water. Then on a new sheet, after copying a page from Augustine's Confessions, he wrote, "Tomlin," and nothing more. For the next week, no notes appeared, no scribbled aphorisms, no hidden names, only silence, a familiar silence. One he had lived inside for so long that it no longer frightened him, but it did make him ache. He feared briefly that he had broken something sacred. But then, on the 7th day, beneath the copied conclusion of a disputation on divine will, he found a single sentence written in the smallest script he had ever seen. "Some truths need names to be heard," and next to it, drawn carefully in ink no darker than a shadow, a quill broken, then mended, bound with a strand of thread. That evening, Tomlin did not sleep. He sat by the brazier, Mater Nostra open across his knees, and wrote no new page. He simply read. Each word now hummed with a resonance deeper than when it was first written. He remembered his mother's voice, not in words but in rhythm, the way she breathed through stories, the pauses, the ache behind her silences, and in that same rhythm now, another voice had found him. Not to rescue, but to meet, to witness, to remind him that even in a city where thousands wrote, few truly read, and fewer still knew how to leave behind silence without breaking it. That winter, in the heart of the coldest season Paris had known in years, 2 hands continued writing on opposite ends of a room, invisible to others, but never alone. The thaw came slowly, not in the dramatic sweep of spring's triumph, but in quiet hints. The first morning without frost on the dormitory windows, the way wax dripped slower from candles, the gentle smell of wet stone rising from the cloisters. Paris softened by inches, not days. And in the still air between those changes, Tomlin's world turned again. He was not yet 20, though the weight in his limbs and the hollows beneath his eyes might have placed him older. His body, drawn tight from years of strain, had grown lean and hard as rope. But beneath the surface, something subtler had shifted. He had learned to be seen, not through voice, not through presence, but through persistence, through ink, through the letters that flowed from his hands, even when no one asked his name. The correspondence with Sabine, though still hidden in the margins, had changed too. It was no longer the casual volley of thinkers cloaked in anonymity. There was something warmer now, the way her script curved into his, the way she left space for him to answer. Her questions became more personal, less rhetorical, more like someone reaching across a distance she could not name. "Did you fear the Abbey?" "Yes, but less than I feared staying behind." "Do you dream in colour or letters?" "Letters, until I wake." "Would you have written if no one ever read you?" "I already have." These fragments became their own language, one never spoken aloud, but as rich and steady as scripture. And slowly, over weeks, the idea of her, this quiet mind walking alongside his, became a presence as tangible as the tools on his desk. Yet they had still never spoken, not once. And perhaps that was what made it sacred. Still, the outside world remained indifferent to sacred things. With the change of seasons came new regulations. The Bishop of Paris, responding to murmurs of heresy and excessive curiosity among student scribes, issued a directive that all non-ordained workers in theological halls must now present a letter of recommendation from their abbot or parish. Tomlin, as a guest of St. Lyron and still not formally listed among the university's registers, had none. The order reached the Sorbonne quietly, passed from the bishop's clerk to Ricardus's hands, and then to Tomlin's desk without ceremony. "You'll need formal sponsorship," Ricardus said. Else you'll be removed. Tomlin said nothing. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. They know your work, Ricardus added, but not your name. Tomlin's voice, soft and certain, answered, They were never meant to. But now, Ricardus said, you must choose whether to remain silent or remain here. Later that night, alone in the dormitory, Tomlin opened Mater Nostra and stared at a blank page. He had thought once that anonymity was protection, that remaining hidden allowed him to move more freely through a world that mistrusted bodies like his. But now he saw the truth. He had been writing in ink, yes, but always with the fear that it might be washed away, that it might not be allowed to stay. And so on that blank page he wrote a letter to the bishop, not pleading, not begging, but explaining. He wrote of his work, of the hundreds of pages he had copied for the university without title, without coin, without credit. He described the ink that stained his fingers so deeply it had become part of him. He wrote of the abbey that first taught him to hold a quill, of the village that once believed knowledge was not his to hold. And then, slowly, he wrote of his mother, the washerwoman with cracked hands and a voice soft as lullabies. He ended with a line so simple it trembled, I do not ask for favour, only to continue. When it was done, he signed his name. Fully. For the first time on any official document, Tomlin of St. Lyron, scribe of margins. He sealed it in wax and gave it to Ricardus the next morning. 3 days passed. Then a reply arrived. The bishop's crest, a brief, formal line. Permission granted for continued service in limited scholarly function. Renewal required in 1 year. Ricardus said nothing, simply handed the letter to Tomlin with a thin smile and returned to his work. But Sabine responded differently. The next margin he opened, hidden between the pages of a copy of De Trinitate, held no question, only a drawing. A boy seated on a stone, ink dripping from his hands like blood, and words flowering around his feet like vines. And below it, the words, You have stepped into the page. Tomlin felt his throat tighten. He traced the drawing with one finger, heart beating with the quiet thunder of recognition. That night, he wrote something new in Mater Nostra. Not about his mother, but about himself. Not what he had done, but what he had feared. That one day no one would remember the boy who lived in the shadows of parchment. But now he had dared to sign the light, and the ink held. With spring came a strange and unfamiliar thing, stillness. For the first time since arriving in Paris, Tomlin found himself no longer at risk of being unseated, unnamed or unseen. The bishop's approval had cast a slender bridge of legitimacy beneath him, fragile, conditional, narrow, but a bridge nonetheless. And across it he began to walk with greater certainty. His work no longer came only from Ricardus or passed through the silent networks of abbey permission. Now students sought him out. Quietly, humbly, they placed their copied drafts at the edge of his desk, not with demands but with hope, a misquoted Aristotle, a flawed summary of Anselm's rebuttals, margins left too wide, margins left too thin. He corrected them in silence, then sent them back with small, neat annotations. No signature, just red ink and precision. But they began to nod to him in the streets. In the refectory, they stepped aside when he passed. In the scriptorium, they watched, not in pity, in respect. He was still not part of the university's core. He held no lectures, he bore no title. His name did not appear on any parchment read aloud during sermons or ceremonies. But it began to appear in whispers. Tomlin fixed my Virgil. Tomlin copies faster than two of us. Tomlin doesn't speak, but he sees everything. And always, always, the margins remained his. Sabine's messages became rarer now, but deeper. Their correspondence had grown more intimate, less frequent, like letters from one heart to another, rather than between minds bound by parchment. When the city sleeps, what do you dream of? She once asked. Tomlin had written of words that no longer require defence. Another time, she left him a folded piece of linen, pressed between two copied pages of the Psalms. It was stitched with a single phrase in red thread. Et visus est sermo, the word became seen. He carried it with him everywhere, tucked near his ribs, just under his tunic. But despite the warmth of this new acceptance, Tomlin was not immune to loneliness. His chamber remained small, his arms still ached each evening with a sharp, dull burn that no oil could soften. He still woke some nights to memories of the village, of rocks under his palms, of laughter that cut like iron, of his mother's quiet breathing as she stitched another man's tunic in silence. He had begun writing fewer lines in Mater Nostra, not because she was forgotten, but because he feared remembering her only in words. He feared trapping her in ink as if she might fade the more perfectly she was preserved. And so he began something new. A book without title, not theology, not a prayer, not even history, something stranger, more fragile. He called it only Sylvae, the forest, a gathering place. Inside it he wrote what had never been asked of him, the things he had seen. Not the great questions of divinity or justice, but the quiet details. The tone of a novice's voice when reciting lines he didn't understand, the way an old scribe cracked his knuckles before copying a dangerous passage, the silence between a question and its answer when both were afraid to be wrong. He wrote about the weather, the slant of rain on a leaded window, the smell of melting wax mixed with rosemary smoke, the sound of worn sandals on wet stone, and he wrote of the things no one else had recorded, of the boy who never raised his voice but never missed a comma, of the girl who practiced her Latin with the pages turned upside down, mouthing each line like a prayer, of Sabine's handwriting when it trembled, when her letters leaned left instead of right. He bound Sylvae himself with thread and glue, wrapping it in scraps of old vellum too damaged to reuse. Each page was imperfect. Some were wrinkled, some had tears, but each one held a piece of the world no one else thought worth saving, and he hid it, not because he was ashamed, but because some things needed to grow quietly, in shadow, before they could speak. Then came the letter from St. Liron. It arrived by courier, bearing the abbey's seal, pressed into black wax. Inside a message from Master Callum, brief, measured. Aldwin has returned. The words hit him like a forgotten bell ringing from the depths of his ribs. Returned, not disappeared, not dismissed, returned. The letter did not say why, it did not say from where, only that he was back, and that he had asked for Tomlin. There was no command, no request, just, he awaits your reply. Tomlin sat long into the night with the letter beside him, watching the candle burn lower and lower. He had not spoken Aldwin's name in more than a year. He had not needed to. The man's voice still echoed behind every line he wrote, behind the way he sat, the way he shaped a sentence like it had weight. Tomlin did not write back. Instead, the next day he began copying a new psalm, Psalm 126. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He copied it twice. Then a third time, each one smaller, each one steadier, and beneath the last he wrote, I learned to write so the world would remember what it ignored. He folded that page, wrapped it in linen and gave it to the courier without a seal. There was no need for one. The ink would hold. Aldwin would know. Tomlin did not expect a response. He had sent his message to St. Liron with no address for return, no instructions, no plea. It was not a question, but a memory pressed into parchment, passed forward as one passes a torch with reverence that it might never return. And yet, 4 days later, a package arrived, small, square, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of rosemary and wood smoke. The novice who delivered it said only, from the abbey, no letter, and turned back down the stone corridor before Tomlin could even offer thanks. He brought it to his chamber with trembling hands, untied it slowly. Inside was a single item, a bound notebook, its leather soft and worn, its stitching uneven but intact. On the front cover, pressed into the hide with a hot stylus, a name, Aldwin, and nothing more. Tomlin sat down on his cot and opened the book. There were no flourishes, no illuminations. The writing inside was plain, utilitarian but unmistakably Aldwin's, the same slant, the same narrow spacing, the familiar looping descenders on his G's and the long sweeping F's. But it wasn't a theological journal, not a sermon, not even lessons. It was a diary, of sorts. It began without preface, as if mid-thought. When I left St. Liron, I carried with me a sin, the conviction that silence protects more than it wounds. I told myself it was mercy. It was not. Tomlin's eyes froze on that line, then continued. The pages that followed recounted Aldwin's departure from the abbey, not as exile, but as pilgrimage. He had travelled, not to another monastery, but into the sick wards of a distant convent, where a fire had taken half the sisters and left the rest figured, voiceless or blind. They did not pray aloud, but they understood each other more fully than those who sang. Tomlin turned the page. I copied for them, Not doctrine, but sound, the rhythm of silence. I wrote what could not be heard, and I began to understand why I had taught you. He read for hours. There were no dates, only vignettes, reflections, small moments of clarity caught between longer spells of questioning. Aldwin wrote of regret but not shame, of grief but not paralysis. And again, Tomlin saw himself in the spaces between the words. I once feared that the world would crush you, but it was never the world I should have feared, it was the quiet. The last page was different, not written in ink, but carved, a stylus pressed deep into the parchment, not harshly, but with purpose. It read, "Write it all, even what hurts, especially that." Beneath it, a small, barely visible cross. Tomlin closed the book and held it to his chest. The fire in his chamber had burned low, the embers casting faint red shadows along the floor. Outside, the streets were quiet, save for the occasional creak of a cartwheel or the muffled footfalls of a watchman. He unwrapped his own manuscript, silver, and laid it beside Aldwin's. 2 books, one bound by silence, one by sight, and suddenly a thought occurred to him. Not a flash, not inspiration, but a quiet certainty. He would not be in Paris forever. He had known that somewhere beneath the surface. The city had given him purpose, taught him clarity, connected him to the currents of knowledge that pulsed through the world's veins. But it was not a place to end. Too many questions were asked here, but too few were remembered. And Tomlin's gift was not only to ask, but to record, to capture, to see. That week he copied less. He walked, or rather moved, more. Crawling when needed, pulled by the strength of his arms, which had now thickened into lean cables. He learned the back alleys of the Latin Quarter. He sat by the Seine and listened to debates outside the stone lecture halls. He began to carry a small slate with chalk, scribbling lines and thoughts like birds catching wind, never lingering long enough to land. And one evening at the scriptorium, Sabine found him waiting. Not writing, not hiding, waiting. She approached slowly, hesitant. He looked up and nodded. And for the first time in over a year, they saw each other not through margins, but with full presence. She sat beside him without speaking. From her satchel, she removed a folded page, one of his. From months ago, a line about his mother, copied in the quiet ink of memory. She placed it between them. "I kept this," she said softly. Her voice was different than he imagined, less formal, lower but warm, because I didn't want the truth to fade. He reached for his slate, wrote, "It never fades, only waits." She smiled. "I wondered if you were real," she whispered. He held up his ink-stained hands. She laughed gently. "I meant, if this was a dream." He looked at her, then slowly reached into his satchel and pulled out Sylvain, placed it in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. She read a page, then another, then stopped and closed it gently, reverently. "You see what others miss," she said. He picked up the chalk. "So someone remembers." She met his eyes and nodded. For a long time they sat in the dim light of the scriptorium, surrounded by the scratch of quills and the whisper of pages turning. 2 people who had lived in the margins, now holding their own text, together. And for the first time since he had left the village, Tomlin felt not only seen, he felt known. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Not in the scriptorium. There, the rustle of parchment and the rhythmic scrape of quills continued like the hum of a hive, but in Tomlin's mind. For the first time in years, his thoughts did not race forward with the urgency of survival or the clawing hunger for recognition. Instead, they unfolded with an unfamiliar softness, like pages turned by a slow and steady hand. He and Sabine did not speak often, but they did not need to. Some afternoons, she sat beside him as he worked, reading silently from her own copies while he wrote. Sometimes they exchanged lines on slips of parchment, still clinging to their old language, the comfort of margins. But now there was space between them that needed no filling, no performance. They simply were. And that was enough. In private, Tomlin began the work Aldwin had urged. He returned to Sylvain and to Mater Nostra and began compiling something larger than both. Something that was not strictly record, nor story, nor theology. Something more human. He didn't have a name for it yet, but he knew its purpose. He would call it the Chronicle of the Unseen, a quiet volume of lives that passed under history's gaze without catching its eye. He would fill it with moments, not miracles, with names that had never entered church registries or royal ledgers. with the silence of women who carried children across frost-laced fields, with the thoughts of scribes who had never spoken their doubt aloud, with the stories of those who had never stood in a pulpit or been draped in a bishop's cloth. He wrote of Brother Marius, who lost the use of his sight in a fire and continued to trace prayers on his desk with inkless fingers, of Sister Clemence, who hummed songs with no words each time she finished a page of Psalms, of the boy who cleaned the scriptorium floors and learned to read by candlelight, though no one ever taught him. He even wrote of the deacon who once called him cursed, and the look in that man's eyes when Tomlin handed him a page more flawless than any sermon he had ever spoken. He wrote in long stretches day and night, sleeping only in snatches when his hands could no longer hold the quill steady. Sabine brought him broth. She replaced his ink. She wrapped his wrists when they swelled, and she read his drafts, not as an editor, but as a witness. "You're building something that doesn't belong to one place," she said once, after reading a section aloud. "It's not a book, it's a lantern." Tomlin smiled and wrote beneath her words, "A lantern for those who don't know they're walking in darkness." In early summer, Ricardus summoned him. The master scribe's chamber was warm, the windows wide open to let in the scent of elderflower. The table before him was covered in scrolls and bound volumes, each marked with a different seal. "You've made enemies," Ricardus said without ceremony. Tomlin tilted his head, waiting. "Some in the university don't like your influence," he continued. "Your presence unsettles the hierarchy. They call it a disordering of the order." He tapped a scroll with his ringed finger. "But others," he added, "have begun to quote you." Tomlin's brows rose slightly. "They don't say it's you, but I know your phrasing. I know your script." He picked up a sheet and held it out. Tomlin read it. A paragraph copied from a disputation on grace, his phrasing, his punctuation, his structure. "They're using your work as their own," Ricardus said, "without credit, without shame." Tomlin looked down. Then slowly, calmly, he wrote on the back of the parchment with a borrowed quill. "If the words survive, I don't mind who carries them." Ricardus studied him for a long moment, then he leaned back in his chair. "Do you want to stay in Paris?" he asked. Tomlin hesitated. "I'm not sure where I belong anymore." Ricardus nodded. "There's a man in Chartres," he said, "an old scribe, maintains a library no one visits. But he keeps everything, even heresy, even poetry. He's looking for a successor." Tomlin blinked. Ricardus continued, "He doesn't care about your legs, only your hands." A pause. "Think about it." Tomlin did. That night he sat by the river with Sabine, the wind lifting her hair in gentle strands. The water murmured softly below them, catching the fading pink light of dusk. She said nothing for a long while. "Then if you go, will you take Sylvain with you?" He nodded. "And me?" He turned his head, then took her hand, slowly, gently, and placed it over the pouch at his chest, the one that carried her linen thread. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he wrote on a scrap of paper, "Some books should be written by two, and beneath that, some lives too." The next morning he visited the Sorbonne one last time. He left a letter for Ricardus, one for the bishop, one for the boy who cleaned the floors, and then quietly he and Sabine packed their things, 2 ink cases, several bound volumes, a jar of gold dust, a bundle of vellum sheets, a small box of dried herbs, and a manuscript, unfinished, untitled, but already glowing, like something born not just of memory, but of mercy. The road to Chartres was long and winding, though it was no longer cruel. The summer sun followed them as they travelled, not harshly, but with the warm steadiness of a companion. The wheels of their cart creaked in slow rhythm, and the old horse, borrowed from a sympathetic student at the Sorbonne, plodded forward with a kind of dignified patience, as if it knew the pace of knowledge and carried it carefully. Tomlin lay on a pallet cushioned with sacks of wool and books, wrapped in a light cloak. His arms, grown thick with years of pulling himself across stone and earth, rested atop his chest. Beside him, Sabine sat cross-legged, sketching in a small leather-bound book. They did not speak much during the journey, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing that required saying. They had passed through quiet villages where time seemed to sleep, and fields where wind moved the wheat like waves. Tomlin watched everything, the patterns of birds, the slant of roofs, the chalk symbols above doorways, and recorded fragments in his mind. Sabine sketched some of it, though not precisely. Her drawings were impressions. A crooked tree, a folded apron, a woman standing beside a window, not quite visible, half lost in shadow. On the fourth day, they reached the edge of the plains that unfurled toward Chartres like a cloth pulled taut. And there, rising out of the earth like a monument to silence, stood the cathedral. Tomlin stared in awe. He had seen Notre Dame, yes, but Chartres was different. Its towers did not simply reach toward heaven, they remembered it. The stained glass glinted like jewels too ancient to name, and its shadows stretched across the fields like arms extended in blessing or warning. Sabine whispered, "It looks like it was carved out of sky." He smiled. The library they sought stood behind the cathedral, partially buried in stone, accessible through a cloister most pilgrims ignored. It was small, quiet, and very old. Its stone walls were thick, its windows narrow, but within it breathed like a living thing. Brother Ibrard, the scribe Ricardus had mentioned, greeted them not with surprise, but with a nod. "I expected someone taller," he said to Tomlin, glancing at the boy's folded legs. Tomlin only raised an eyebrow, then retrieved a folded sheet from his satchel. He handed it over. Ibrard read it, twice, then said, "You write taller than most." And that was enough. He led them into the library, a vaulted room lined with shelves built from dark oak, parchment hung from hooks, scrolls lay in bundles, and codices were stacked stones in a forgotten well. The air smelled of wax and dust and something older, like pages that had never been turned. "This is the place for unwanted things," Ibrard said, "books exiled for errors, texts copied imperfectly, pages that no longer fit in doctrine but are too beautiful to burn." Sabine turned slowly, eyes wide. Tomlin felt the heat rise behind his eyes. Not from sadness, from recognition. This place, too, had been built by margins. Ibrard showed them the desks, the parchment stores, the inkstones. A small room off to the side had been cleared for their use. A bed, a writing table, a basin. "No one will bother you here," he said. You can work at your own pace, as long as the books continue to breathe." They began the next morning. Tomlin rose early, his fingers already twitching with the need to shape. Sabine lit the oil lamp, trimmed the wick, and handed him the first quill. He dipped it in ink without a word, and he began, not to copy, to write. He returned to the Chronicle of the Unseen, the work he had begun in silence, in shadow. But now it changed, not in purpose, but in voice. His hand steadied with certainty. His phrasing deepened. He no longer wrote with the fear of being erased. Each entry was a seed, a record of someone forgotten, a story gathered like thread from the edge of a torn garment, a fragment that refused to vanish. He wrote of the boy with the twisted foot who carved perfect spirals into pews when the monks weren't looking, of the old woman in Rouen who could not read, but memorized entire psalms by sound alone, and recited them backwards during storms to calm the children, of the blind baker who gave bread by touch, not measure, of the soldier who taught birds to land on his shoulder because he missed the weight of his brother's arm. And he wrote of Aldwyn in full, not as a teacher or a ghost or a voice behind a quill, but as a man who chose silence, then broke it, not to speak, but to teach another how to speak. Ibrard watched their work without interfering. Sometimes he read pages and grunted softly. Other times he sat by the window and hummed plain chant that had no words. One evening, as the sun poured through the stained glass and painted the room in reds and blues, Sabine handed Tomlin a small note. He unfolded it. "What will you do when it's finished?" He thought for a long while. Then wrote, "Bind it, bury it, or leave it open. Let the world decide what it needs." She wrote beneath it, "The world has never known what it needs. That's why people like you must write." Tomlin did not reply. He only reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. And for that evening they stopped writing. Not because there were no more stories, but because sometimes the quiet must be given its own chapter. And so beneath the arches of a forgotten library, lit by sun older than time, they sat beside each other. 2 scribes, 2 lanterns, and a book full of truths that no longer fit in the margins. Autumn came early in Chartres. It slipped into the air one morning like an uninvited guest, crisp, quiet, and utterly certain. Leaves along the cloister walls browned at the edges. The wind whispered through the cathedral's spires, brushing against the stained glass with a sound like breath over parchment. And inside the library behind the great stone nave, Tomlin's pen did not slow. If anything, it deepened. The Chronicle of the Unseen had grown far beyond what he first imagined. It no longer resembled a collection or a commentary. It had become a kind of echo chamber, each story amplifying another, each forgotten soul written into it, casting light on the next. The library had turned into their world. Sabine copied the structure of the entries onto clean vellum, adding small illustrations, rarely of people but of what surrounded them, the curve of a spindle, a window partly open, a spoon worn down to its core. She believed, and Tomlin agreed, that these objects carried the soul of their owners long after their names faded. Tomlin had begun binding pages in sections, organising them not by chronology but by resonance. The widow from the coast who sang at sundown was placed beside the mute stable boy who tapped his thoughts into the walls. The monk who could not remember faces but remembered every prayer was grouped with the leper who carved each letter of the Psalms into bark, one each day, until his hands gave out. One day Brother Ebrard entered the library, holding a box. He said nothing, just placed it beside Tomlin's writing bench and sat heavily on the stone step beside the window. Tomlin waited. After a while, Ebrard spoke. "You keep asking about those who weren't remembered," he said. "Well, this box belonged to one." Tomlin looked at him. A scribe from decades ago, crippled from birth, could barely speak. No one thought he'd survive the Abbey novitiate. But he did. He nodded at the box. He wrote just one thing, a letter, to no one. Tomlin opened the box carefully. Inside, wrapped in linen that had yellowed with age, was a scroll. The ink had faded, but the writing was meticulous. Not beautiful, not ornate, but deliberate, each letter carefully formed, as if the writer had convinced the quill to obey not through talent, but through force of will. Tomlin unrolled the scroll with reverent fingers. It read, "If my body is not counted, let my line be counted. If my voice is not heard, let this curve of ink make a sound where I could not. I do not ask to be seen, I ask to remain." Tomlin closed his eyes. He had never met this scribe, never seen his face, never heard his name. But he knew him. He was him. He carefully added the scroll to the chronicle, between two pages, protected by a fold of thicker vellum. He did not assign it a title. He let it stand as it was, because some stories are already whole. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the carved arches of the cathedral, Sabine brought him a gift. A satchel, hand-sewn, with straps that could be pulled across the shoulder and under the arm, designed to rest firmly against his chest, weighted evenly, leaving his arms free. Inside it, two smaller compartments for ink, parchment and thread. He looked up at her. "For the road," she said. He tilted his head, brow raised. Sabine sat beside him. Her voice was soft. "They've asked me to speak in Poitiers," she said, "to read from the Chronicle." His heart quickened, not from surprise, but from the realization that this work, this fragile gathering of the forgotten, had reached ears beyond the stone of the cloister. "They'll want to know who wrote it," she added. Tomlin took a moment, then picked up his chalk and slate. He wrote, "Let them wonder." She smiled. "But will you come?" He nodded. Not quickly, not with fanfare, just once, with absolute clarity. Because it was time. Time to leave the library not as a refuge, but as a starting place. Time to carry the Chronicle into the world. Time to let it be questioned, challenged, doubted, even misunderstood. Because it was written not for safety. It was written for the world that forgets, and for those who refuse to let it. The next morning, as the mist curled along the edges of the cathedral steps, Tomlin sat at his bench one last time. He sharpened his quill, he opened a fresh page, and at the very top, in firm, unflinching letters, he wrote, "In nomine aurum qui non sunt memorati," in the name of those who are not remembered. Then he began a new chapter, not of the Chronicle, of his life. They left Chartres just as the bells of Prime began to toll, their sound slow and resonant, echoing over the golden fields like the last sigh of summer. The road to Poitiers curved through dense woods and open farmland, then cut sharply southward, where the terrain grew rockier and the sky seemed to widen with every mile. Tomlin and Sabine travelled with few belongings. Their shared satchel, the Chronicle bound in coarse linen, 2 bundles of vellum for notes, and a small pouch of coin offered by Brother Ebrard with the simple words, "To pay for what memory cannot." Though the journey was long, it was gentler now. They moved at a pace of their choosing. Tomlin no longer feared the roads, no longer felt the urgent pressure of proving himself with every step or mark on a page. His arms still carried the weight of his body, but the burden felt lighter, not because the path had changed, but because he no longer walked it alone. Sabine took notes during their stops, sketching not the towns themselves, but the unseen pieces of them, the space between chimneys, the angles of silence where no one looked. She recorded fragments of overheard conversation, snippets of prayers muttered by travelling friars, the way chickens scattered before carts. And Tomlin listened. He listened to the wind in the leaves, to the breathing of the earth, to the quiet tremble in the voice of an old woman who gave them shelter one night in her barn and, unprompted, told them about the son she had lost in a spring flood 50 years ago. "No one remembers him now," she said, stirring porridge over a low fire. "Even I forget what he sounded like." But Tomlin didn't forget. That night, by lamplight, he copied her story into a spare page, writing not just what she said, but how she said it, haltingly, as if pulling the words from beneath water. The page ended with a single line, shaped like a question but offered like a blessing. "If a child once laughed, is the world not changed forever?" They arrived in Poitiers a week later. The city was larger than Chartres, but less solemn. Its streets were full of noise and light, the scent of summer fruit curling around the stone buildings like perfume. Children ran through alleyways, and merchants sang their prices like hymns. Sabine had been invited to speak at a gathering of scholars hosted by a small priory known for its interest in new forms of history. Tomlin had expected scepticism, dismissal, polite, quiet nods followed by the usual doubts. But instead, he found something else. Curiosity, the kind that leaned forward, the kind that didn't flinch at silence or bend toward hierarchy. The room where she spoke was modest, walls lined with unbound texts, a window open to the wind. Sabine reads slowly, clearly, lifting her voice not to command but to reveal. She read the story of the blind baker, of the girl who memorized psalms backwards, of the washerwoman who sang when no one was near. She did not name Tomlin, but she placed the chronicle on the table before her with both hands. "This was not written to be owned," she said, "only to be heard." The listeners, clergy, scribes, a few wandering poets, were silent when she finished. Not with discomfort, but reverence. Some nodded, one wept quietly, and afterward they asked questions, not about dates, not about doctrine, but about remembrance. "Do you believe memory is holy?" one young monk asked. Sabine looked to Tomlin. He picked up a piece of slate and wrote, "Only when it is shared." That night, as the stars bloomed across the sky in velvet darkness, they sat in the courtyard of the priory, Tomlin wrapped in his cloak, Sabine beside him, a candle flickering between them. "You've made something the world didn't know it needed," she whispered. Tomlin shook his head gently. "We made it!" She reached for the chronicle and opened to a page near the centre. The story of a nameless child in a nameless village, crippled from birth, carried on his mother's back, crawling through mud, watching pilgrims pass by like dreams. She read it silently, her lips barely moving, then closed the book. "Is it strange," she asked, "to sit beside the one you once were?" Tomlin stared into the candle flame, then picked up the chalk. "It feels like holding a ghost that forgave me." In the days that followed, word of the chronicle spread further. A student asked to copy a few entries for his monastery's collection. A travelling friar begged to carry a section with him to read aloud in poor towns. A noblewoman offered to bind it in dyed leather, blue like the windows of Chartres. But Tomlin declined. He kept the chronicle wrapped in plain linen, not hidden, just humble, because it was not meant to dazzle, it was meant to endure. He and Sabine spent 3 more weeks in Poitiers, recording new voices, collecting new fragments. A mute musician who carved notes into bark, a midwife who remembered every child's cry but forgot their names, a shepherd who taught his flock to kneel at dusk. Each one added to the book, each one made it heavier. But Tomlin never stumbled. His arms, though scarred, carried the weight with ease, because this was his cathedral. Each page a pillar, each margin a window, each forgotten soul a choir that never stopped singing. They left Poitiers in the late light of an autumn morning, when the city was still stretching its limbs and brushing dreams from its rooftops. There were no trumpets, no farewells, just the soft creak of their cart's wheels as it turned eastward along a path lined with thinning trees and fields left fallow for winter. Sabine guided the horse gently, reins loose in her hand. Tomlin sat beside her with the chronicle in his lap, wrapped carefully, as though it was sleeping. The world had changed again, not because their names had become known, they hadn't, but because the silence around them had shifted. It was no longer defensive, no longer a veil to hide behind. It was deliberate now, like a space carved for breath between notes in a song, a pause that gave meaning to all that came before and all that would come after. They travelled without hurry, stopping in villages both small and smaller still. Some had no church, only a wooden cross planted at a crossroads. Others had chapels so old they leaned into the hills like aging pilgrims, their doors held together with iron and memory. At each place they listened, that was all. They didn't declare themselves as chroniclers or scholars. Tomlin didn't present the chronicle unless asked. Sabine rarely spoke of their purpose unless someone invited her to sit. But in every place, someone came forward. It happened quietly, naturally. A gesture, a look, a need to be heard that had been waiting so long it no longer knew how to raise its voice. And they wrote. A beekeeper who spoke only in proverbs and had lost her son to wolves. A mute girl who composed poems by arranging coloured stones on a cloth. A boy who had memorised all the local birth dates and recited them nightly like prayers, afraid they would vanish if he did not. One evening, under a pale half-moon, they camped beside a half-broken shrine in a clearing where wildflowers still grew in defiance of the season. The shrine bore no name, only a faded carving of an open hand. They built a small fire, shared a loaf of bread and hard cheese, and Sabine began to hum, low, tuneless, almost unconscious. Tomlin, with his back against the wheel, held his writing slate in his lap, but he didn't write. He simply watched her. Her hair caught the firelight like threads of copper. Her face, no longer sharp with the wariness she'd once worn in Paris, had softened into something unguarded. She met his gaze after a while, her voice fading. I keep wondering, she said, when it will end. Tomlin wrote, The book? No, she said. This, us, the road, the stories, the way people look at us, not with doubt anymore, but with hope. It frightens me. He thought for a long moment, then erased the slate and wrote, Hope is a quiet house. You hear everything inside it. She smiled. Then let's never lock the door. In the weeks that followed, they reached more settlements, some warm, some wary. But in each, the chronicle grew, and slowly a pattern emerged. People began to speak of it before they arrived. In one hamlet, a woman said, Are you the ones with the book? In another, they said you carry a light, but not on a pole, in pages. At first, Tomlin resisted the attention. He had lived so long in the margins, it felt unnatural to be read aloud. But Sabine reminded him gently, They aren't worshipping you, they're finding themselves. He nodded and continued writing. They arrived in a highland village as the first snows began to fall, coating the roofs in sugar and muffling footsteps. The people there were shy but kind. They offered stew and dried apples and a place in the old sacristy to sleep. It was there that Tomlin met a man who changed the chronicle forever. His name was Lorik. He had no hands. They met when Tomlin heard a strange tapping in the dark, soft, methodical, coming from the nave of the village chapel. He followed the sound and found Lorik sitting on the floor with a piece of charcoal tied to the end of his arm with cloth and twine, tapping it against a plank of wood. He wasn't writing, he was marking time. Every heartbeat, every breath, every blink, marked. Lorik looked up when Tomlin approached. He nodded once, then gestured to the marks. I used to be a drummer, he said, voice gravelly, until the frost took my hands. Tomlin wrote, What are you doing now? Lorik tapped once more, keeping what's left. They sat in silence for a long while. Then Lorik added, No one writes me down anymore. Tomlin's chest tightened. He unwrapped the chronicle and opened to a blank page. He dipped his quill and in careful strokes wrote Lorik's name at the top. And then he wrote, He marks the world not with words, but with presence, with rhythm, with the sound of staying. Lorik stared at the page, his throat moved once, then twice. But he said nothing. Instead he nodded. And when Tomlin reached for the string of charcoal tied to Lorik's arm, the man allowed him to retie it, tighter, cleaner. The next morning, as snow fell gently through the chapel roof, Lorik pressed the tip of the charcoal to the blank space below his name and made a mark. Just one, a dot. But it was his, and it was there. The snow deepened as they continued east. It fell softly at first, in slow drifts that painted the branches white and gathered gently on rooftops. Then it thickened, layering the world in silence. Paths vanished, roads blurred, villages folded in upon themselves, smoke rising from chimneys like sighs too old to name. Tomlin and Sabine adjusted their pace accordingly. They travelled less often, stayed longer in each place. The chronicle, now nearing the weight of a child, was wrapped in wool and carried close. When they entered a village, they sought not an audience but a hearth, any hearth, and let the stories find them, because they always did. In a small town shaped around a frozen lake, a widow brought them to her table and served cabbage stew with a trembling ladle. Her voice was small but steady, and she spoke of her brother, gone 20 years, who had once carved tiny birds from scrap wood and left them on neighbours' windowsills without ever speaking a word. He was afraid, she said, of being thanked. Tomlin wrote the story carefully, and when he finished, he took from his satchel a small carving Sabine had made, a crude sparrow whittled from driftwood found on the road, and placed it on the windowsill beside them. The woman didn't speak. She simply covered her mouth with her hand and left it there for a long time. In another hamlet, high in the hills, they met a man named Etienne, who had written over 30 psalms, but never on parchment. He had etched them into the beams of his barn, one letter at a time, using the corner of a dulled chisel. "They're too holy to leave the page," he said, voice thick with cold, "so I gave them to the wood." Tomlin traced the lines with gloved fingers, then copied them into the chronicle, not perfectly, but with reverence. The letters were worn by time and weather, but still visible, still breathing. That night, he added a new preface to the chronicle. "This book is not the only book. The world writes its own, in beams and bone, in calluses and silence. We are only its listeners." Sabine, curled beside the fire, read the words aloud and nodded. "They'll forget that someday," she said. Tomlin wrote back, "Then let them read it again." By the time they reached the abbey at Montreux, an ageing stone monastery nestled between cliffs and pine, they had gathered over 200 stories, some short as a breath, others spanning pages, each one a thread carefully knotted, quietly held. The abbey welcomed them not as guests but as pilgrims. There was a cloister garden, bare in winter, but with paths neatly swept, a chapel with an open roof that let snow drift in like ash, and a library that smelled of mould, ink, and lavender oil. It was there, among crumbling codices and forgotten ledgers, that Tomlin found the page. It had no title, no context, just a line. "He who has no place in the world will become its memory." No scribe's mark, no date. He stared at it for a long time, then turned the page over and wrote beneath it, "He who remembers is no longer alone." That evening, he and Sabine sat by the hearth with the monks. A few of them sang, their voices cracked but warm. One recited riddles in Latin with childlike joy. Another played a lute with 3 strings and a missing bridge, the notes broken but beautiful. And Tomlin, for the first time, opened the chronicle not just to record, but to share. He read aloud. He spoke not with his voice, but through her, Sabine's voice steady, slow, wrapping each word like cloth around a wound. She read the story of the washerwoman who sang to her son in the winter dark. Of the scribe with one arm who held his quill in his teeth. Of the child who wrote letters on the walls with soot because no one gave him ink. The monks listened in stillness. When she finished, no one clapped, no one praised. But one of them, an old man with trembling hands, reached for a quill and wrote 3 lines on a scrap of parchment. He held it out to Tomlin. It read, "I thought I was forgotten, but tonight I felt written. That is enough." Tomlin folded the scrap and placed it in the chronicle. No edits, no flourish. And in the quiet that followed, with snow falling soft beyond the chapel windows, he looked at Sabine, her eyes reflecting the firelight, her breath slow and steady, and wrote one final line before sleep. "We are not wandering anymore, we are being found." By spring, the chronicle had begun to breathe on its own. It no longer felt like a book Tomlin carried. It felt like something he accompanied, something alive. Each page now bore the thumbprints of the world, smudges of ash from hearths, crumbs from roadside bread, flecks of wax where candles had flickered too close. The spine, once taut and stiff, had loosened with time, creaking softly when opened, like a voice clearing its throat. They stayed longer at Montreux than they had intended. The abbey was quiet, but not still. The monks moved like wind through old branches, gentle, practiced, purposeful, and then no one asked Tomlin or Sabine to remain. No one asked them to leave either. It was an unspoken invitation, a silence of welcome. Tomlin spent his mornings in the scriptorium, not copying, but listening, to footsteps, to birdsong, to the scratch of quills on other desks, steady as breath. And in the afternoons he wrote, but not just the stories of others. He began, finally, to write his own. It was harder than he expected, not because he didn't remember, but because he remembered too well. Each moment returned with the weight of its silence. The first time he realised his legs would never move like others. The way the village priest once paused mid-sermon when he saw Tomlin at the back pew, as if holiness had suddenly slipped away. But he wrote through it. He wrote the ache of being carried too long, the shame of crawling through mud, the comfort of his mother's back, the sound of her breath as she hummed over laundry. He wrote the sting of pity, the sharpness of absence, the joy of learning the shape of his own name in ink. And when he reached the chapter where Aldwyn first knelt beside him in the chapel, when the priest had asked him his name like it mattered, Tomlin stopped, not from pain, but because he couldn't see the page through his tears. Sabine found him like that, bent over the desk, hands still, quill resting in the groove of his thumb. She said nothing, just sat beside him and opened the chronicle to a blank page. With careful, deliberate motion, she wrote one line, "He taught us all to kneel," and left it unsigned. That night, they placed the newest pages into the chronicle's final section, a part Tomlin had once hesitated to name. But now it bore a simple title, Reckonings, not conclusions, just moments of turning. Days passed. Spring warmed the stone halls of the abbey, coaxing green from the grey. Ivy climbed the southern wall. The monks took to eating in the garden when weather allowed. The bells rang more cheerfully, as if shaking off a long, necessary grief. And on the morning of Ascension, a visitor arrived. He was old, older than any man Tomlin had ever met. He wore no habit, only a travelling cloak and boots dusted with earth. His eyes were cloudy and his spine bent slightly, but his hands were as steady as scripture. He carried a staff and a bundle, no companions, no title. He introduced himself simply as Luke, and when he saw the chronicle he laughed, not mockingly but with wonder. "I was told," he said, "it was too large to carry. I see now it's just large enough." Tomlin offered him a seat. Luke accepted. Over the next 3 days, the man read. He read without pause, without question. Every name, every line. He traced the pages with his fingertips as though they might slip away. He wept twice, laughed once, and on the 4th day he closed the chronicle and asked a single question. "Will you leave it here?" Sabine looked at Tomlin. He did not answer right away. Then, slowly, he shook his head. He wrote on his slate, "It must keep walking." Luke nodded. "I thought you might say that." And then he unwrapped the bundle he had carried all the way from a distant monastery in the east. Inside were pages, not blank, but waiting. Vellum dyed by time, yellowed but strong, lines faintly drawn, a margin already measured. And at the top of the first page, in letters so familiar, Tomlin felt his breath catch. "For those who come after." Luke smiled. "I began this when I was your age. I thought I was the only one who remembered the forgotten. But I was only the first who knew he had to start." He pushed the pages forward. "Now it's yours." Tomlin stared at them, then took them, not with reverence, with responsibility, because something old had found its echo. That evening, Tomlin opened the chronicle to the very last page and in a hand steady with purpose wrote, "This is not the end." Then he placed the chronicle beside the new pages, bound them together with care, and beneath it added one final line, small, almost hidden, but sure, "Let them keep," and so they would.